In the heart of Poland, a city once filled with laughter and factory smoke would soon fall under a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself had died. When the Nazis marched into Lodz, they didn't just occupy the streets. They seized time itself. Within months, fences of wood and wire carved the city into a world apart, trapping more than 160,000 souls in a prison built not for punishment, but for slow erasure. Inside those fences, hunger became law, children disappeared without sound, and survival meant becoming useful to the very people who wanted you gone. Yet from that darkness, an entire underground world began to hum. Machines sewing, hammers striking, men and women fighting death with labor. This wasn't just another ghetto. It was an industry of survival, a place where hope wore a uniform, and every heartbeat was a rebellion. What happened inside the Lodz Ghetto would test the very limits of what it means to be human. Chapter 1. The Fall of Lodz, September 1939. It began before dawn, with a thunder that did not come from the sky. The ground itself trembled as columns of steel rolled across Poland's western border. The sound of engines, treads, and boots merged into a single metallic heartbeat, the pulse of an empire on the move. In the city of Lodz, shopkeepers closing their shutters thought it was thunder until they saw the horizon flashing. The war had come, and no one was ready for how quickly it would devour them. By the time the first German bombers appeared above the rooftops, the city's church bells had fallen silent. Air raid sirens screamed over the hum of factories, still trying to finish their final shifts. Men in aprons and women carrying baskets froze where they stood, watching the black crosses painted on the wings descending like a flock of crows. The explosions came moments later, deafening, blinding, filling the air with dust and burning fabric. The streets of Lodz, once lined with trams and chatter, were suddenly rivers of smoke. The invasion of Poland had begun, and Lodz was one of its first victims. Within days, German troops were everywhere. Tanks rolled through Piotrkowska Street, their treads crushing cobblestones that had once carried carriages and children's laughter. Soldiers shouted orders in a language that felt colder than the autumn air. Shops owned by Jewish families were smashed open, their signs ripped down, their goods tossed into the street. The occupation was not simply military, it was psychological. Every sound, every footstep, reminded the people of Lodz that they were now living in someone else's world. Before the war, Lodz had been a city of industry and diversity. Polish, Jewish, and German communities working side by side in a maze of textile factories and narrow streets. But in September 1939, that delicate balance shattered. The Nazis saw Lodz not as a home to 500,000 people, but as a resource, a machine waiting to be stripped for parts. It was Poland's second-largest industrial city, and that made it valuable. What they did next would turn that value into a weapon against its own people. On September 8th, German forces marched officially into Lodz, led by the 8th Army under General Johannes Blaskowitz. The city surrendered without a formal battle. The Polish defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, had already withdrawn eastward. The Nazi flag rose over the city hall, and with it came the first decrees. All Polish officials were dismissed. All Jewish businesses were seized. Curfews were imposed. Loudspeakers on the streets blared German commands that most citizens didn't yet understand. What they did understand was the tone, the sharpness, the finality. Jewish residents, nearly 1/3 of the city's population, became immediate targets. German soldiers humiliated them in public, forcing rabbis to scrub the streets, cutting off beards with knives, burning prayer books for sport. Neighbors who once exchanged greetings now looked away. Fear divided the city faster than any wall could. Within a week, it wasn't safe to walk down certain streets wearing a Star of David or speaking Yiddish. The occupation authorities wasted no time in reshaping Lodz into what they called Litzmannstadt, a name chosen to honor a German general from the First World War. Even the city's identity was stripped away. Street names were changed, Polish words erased from signs, and German became the only permitted language in official use. To the invaders, renaming was not symbolism. It was conquest made permanent. Erase the name, and you erase the memory. Rumors spread quickly through the narrow streets. Stories of deportations, of mass executions in nearby villages, of Jews being rounded up and sent somewhere for work. But in those early months, no one could imagine what work truly meant. Many thought it would be temporary. They clung to a fragile hope that order would return, that the nightmare would pass. But the Nazi plan for Poland, known as General Plan Ost, had no space for coexistence. It was designed for domination, exploitation, and elimination. The people of Lodz began to live in whispers. Every knock at the door carried danger. Every German patrol meant the possibility of arrest. The city's Jewish community councils tried to negotiate, to keep track of new rules that changed daily. Jews were forced to wear white armbands marked with blue stars of David. They were forbidden from public transport, banned from certain streets, and forced to surrender valuables, gold, radios, even bicycles. Those caught hiding possessions were beaten or shot on sight. Amid this terror, one figure emerged who would soon dominate Jewish life in Lodz. Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski, a former orphanage director. He was appointed by the Germans as der Altestergen, the elder of the Jews, to administer the city's Jewish population. At first, it seemed like a bureaucratic role, a mediator between the Nazis and the community. But no one yet realized how much power and how much moral weight that title would carry in the months ahead. As winter approached, the city began to change shape. German settlers arrived from the Reich, moving into confiscated Polish homes. Polish families were expelled to the countryside. German police forces, the Gestapo, and SS units flooded the city. The Jews were herded into smaller and smaller districts, unofficially at first, through intimidation and temporary zones. By December, German officials were already planning something far more permanent, a walled-off area that would contain every Jewish soul in Lodz. While these plans took form, daily life decayed. Factories reopened, but under German control. Wages were replaced with food rations so small that starvation began to spread. Black markets emerged in alleyways, where bread cost more than a week's labor. In the courtyards, people whispered about disappearances, fathers taken at night, mothers never returning from the Gestapo office. The air smelled of damp wood, burnt paper, and fear. Outside the city, the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into Poland. Warsaw was under siege. Refugees poured into Lodz by the thousands, hoping to find safety in its industrial heart. But the city had no safety left to offer. German checkpoints surrounded every road. Refugees were trapped, adding more chaos to an already collapsing world. By the end of that year, the Jewish population swelled to more than 230,000 people, making it one of the largest in occupied Poland. Propaganda posters covered the walls, written in sharp Gothic letters, promising a new order under German rule. The words were clean and official. The reality was filthy and violent. German soldiers paraded captured Polish officers through the streets, while photographers documented the moment. Each photograph became part of the campaign, proof of Nazi triumph, warning to anyone who still dared to resist. The occupation wasn't just about control, it was about spectacle. In those early weeks, the sound of boots on cobblestone became the city's new heartbeat. Even the weather seemed to change. Cold winds cut through alleys that had once smelled of bread and coal smoke. Churches echoed half-empty prayers. Synagogues stood abandoned, windows shattered, scrolls stolen. To survive meant to vanish in plain sight, to move quietly, speak softly, and hope your name stayed off the list being compiled in the new German offices. Each new decree tightened the noose. Jews could not keep pets. Jews could not walk on main streets. Jews could not own businesses. Each restriction was small on its own, but together they turned daily life into slow suffocation. Many tried to leave, but escape routes were sealed. The railway stations, once symbols of connection, became gateways to nowhere. Tickets were denied, passports revoked. The city itself became a trap. Still, there were moments of resistance, small, desperate, and unseen. Polish underground networks began forming in secret. Jewish youth groups met at night to share information, smuggling letters and food through hidden routes. Some even painted graffiti on walls, crude symbols of defiance quickly covered by German authorities the next morning. But for every act of rebellion, the reprisals grew harsher. Public hangings became warnings. Fear was no longer an emotion. It was policy. By November, German civil administrators began referring to Lodz as cleaning up the Polish question. Entire neighborhoods were being mapped and labeled by ethnicity. Blueprints marked Jüdisches Wohngebiet, Jewish residential zone, circulated through offices. The idea of a ghetto was no longer theoretical. It was logistical. The Nazis were turning human lives into data, into numbers that could be organized, relocated, and eventually erased. At night, the city glowed faintly under blackout curtains. The hum of factories had been replaced by the rumble of military trucks. In the silence that followed, people could hear the trains, distant, rhythmic, moving through the dark. They didn't yet know where those trains would lead, but the sound carried something cold and final. Children woke to the noise and asked their parents where the trains were going. The parents had no answer. Among the German officers in charge of Lodz was a businessman named Hans Bibo, who saw opportunity in the chaos. He recognized the city's factories, warehouses, and workshops as a potential economic engine for the Reich. To him, the Jews of Lodz were not people but labor. Their survival would depend not on mercy, but on utility. In the months ahead, he would work closely with Rumkowski to transform the ghetto into what he called a self-financing enterprise. The seeds of that grim partnership were planted here, in the ruins of a city just conquered. As the first snow fell that winter, Lodz no longer resembled the place it once was. German signs hung over every store. Soldiers patrolled every corner. The laughter of children had vanished, replaced by the barking of dogs and the echo of boots. Families burned furniture for heat. Letters from the outside world stopped arriving. The city was no longer a city. It was an open-air cage waiting to be sealed. And yet, beneath the cold and silence, something still stirred. People had books. They whispered prayers. They wrote diaries by candlelight, recording what they feared no one would ever read. They didn't know it, but they were documenting the birth of one of the darkest chapters in human history, the creation of the Lodz Ghetto. As 1939 ended, the fences began to rise. Wooden posts, barbed wire, German guards. A wall between the living and the forgotten. The people inside still believed they could endure, that work and obedience might keep them alive. They didn't yet understand that the fences were not being built to protect them. They were being built to erase them. And somewhere, beyond those unfinished walls, the sound of hammers and trucks continued, the first steps toward an industry of survival. The next chapter of their story was already being written in secret reports, in architectural blueprints, in orders stamped and signed in Berlin. The city of Lodz had fallen. The ghetto was about to rise. Chapter 2. Creating a Ghetto of Labor, February, April 1940. By the first months of 1940, Lodz no longer breathed like a living city. It moved in a dull rhythm of fear, boots, whistles, commands shouted in German, doors slamming, and the shuffle of people who had learned to walk without drawing attention. Snow lay heavy over the streets, muting the world into a pale silence. But behind that silence, something monstrous was taking shape. What began as occupation was now becoming containment. What had been a city was about to become a cage. The orders came quietly, from offices where German officials smoked and stamped papers. The men in those rooms used words like efficiency and administration. They spoke of Jewish districts, resettlement, and orderly transition. But on the streets, these words meant only one thing. The walls were closing in. In February 1940, the Nazi civil administration announced that all Jews in Lodz were to be concentrated into a single, enclosed area. The city's Jewish population, more than 230,000 people, would soon be sealed behind fences, locked away from the world. The man overseeing this transformation was Hans Bibo, the same businessman who had seen opportunity in conquest. To him, Lodz was not a city of souls, but a machine waiting to be reorganized. He looked at the Jewish population and saw manpower, cheap, desperate, and expendable. He needed them alive, at least for now, to work. So he and his superiors devised a plan. The Jews would be confined, but kept productive. They would supply the Reich's war industry, while slowly starving inside. It was, in the cold logic of the occupation, a perfect arrangement. German engineers and police units began mapping the area designated for the ghetto, the northern districts of Baladi and Old Town, the poorest and most dilapidated parts of the city. The choice was deliberate. These were neighborhoods already overcrowded, full of narrow streets and crumbling tenements. The Germans didn't need to build much. The misery was already there. The new boundaries were drawn with red pencil on city maps, each line sealing thousands of lives into shrinking blocks. Rumors spread quickly. Families whispered that fences were coming. Some tried to move out, to find shelter with Polish friends on the other side of the city, but it was already too late. The roads were closed, and German patrols stopped anyone carrying luggage. By March, carpenters, Jewish and Polish, were ordered to begin constructing wooden barriers and barbed wire fences. They worked under armed guard, building the very walls that would soon imprison them. Every hammer strike echoed through the streets, a sound both ordinary and horrifying. The Germans called it Sicherung, security. The people inside called it what it was, entrapment. The fences rose fast, cutting through roads, dividing families, isolating entire neighborhoods. Electric lamps were mounted on posts. Watchtowers appeared at intersections. German police patrolled the perimeter with dogs. Signs warned that anyone attempting to cross without permission would be shot. Within weeks, Lodz was split in two worlds, the free and the condemned. Inside the zone, chaos ruled. Overcrowding became unbearable. Apartments meant for one family now held 5 or 6. Whole families slept on floors, in stairwells, in cellars. Furniture disappeared as people burned it for warmth. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and damp cloth. The once vibrant markets were silent. Food was rationed by the Germans, distributed through local committees under the supervision of the new Jewish administration. Hunger became the first dictator of the ghetto. Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski stood at the center of this new order. His office in the old Judenrat building became the brain of a city that was no longer a city. The Germans had given him near total authority over Jewish life in Lodz. To them, he was a convenient tool, a man who could enforce their commands without requiring German soldiers to do the dirty work. To his people, he was both savior and tyrant. He believed, perhaps genuinely, that obedience and productivity could save lives. He called it salvation through labor. But no one could yet see how costly that belief would become. Rumkowski began organizing what he called the departments of function. Each department handled a part of ghetto life: housing, health, education, food distribution, labor, and sanitation. At first, it looked like bureaucracy, but it was really survival engineering. Every paper signed meant a life slightly extended. Every delay in deportation a victory, however small. Yet even those victories came wrapped in cruelty. To distribute food, one had to choose who ate and who starved. To assign work, one had to decide who was worth saving. The first official decree sealing the ghetto came on April 30th, 1940. On that day, German soldiers closed the gates, ending all movement in or out. Lodz's Jewish population was now trapped within a 3.5 square kilometer area. Around it stood barbed wire, machine guns, and death. Outside, Polish and German residents went about their lives, while inside, 200,000 people disappeared from sight. The ghetto was now a separate world, invisible, voiceless, and expendable. The Germans renamed it Ghetto Litzmannstadt. It was not to be a temporary camp, but a long-term experiment. The idea was to make it self-sustaining, a city that fed, governed, and policed itself while producing goods for the Reich. Bibo called it an enterprise of labor. In his reports, he bragged that the Jewish workers cost almost nothing and could be kept alive on minimal rations. He even proposed that profits from their labor could fund their own imprisonment. The cynicism was absolute. Inside the ghetto, life rearranged itself under impossible conditions. Streets were clogged with carts, furniture, and people carrying what little they had managed to save. German police confiscated valuables at the gates: jewelry, watches, tools, even wedding rings. Each person was allowed only what they could carry. Families were separated in the chaos, some forced into buildings already filled beyond capacity. In the first days, hundreds died from exhaustion and cold. Their bodies were buried in makeshift pits before a formal cemetery could even be organized. Food became the currency of existence. Official rations were starvation level, barely 200 calories a day for adults, less for children. The Judenrat tried to stretch supplies by opening soup kitchens, but there was never enough. People traded clothing, furniture, even wedding bands for bread. Those with connections to labor assignments received slightly larger rations, reinforcing Rumkowski's belief that work meant life. Others, too weak to work, were left to beg or die quietly. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, carried by lice, thrived in the overcrowded rooms and contaminated water. Doctors worked without medicine, boiling instruments in tin pots, using sugar water as fluid. Hospitals overflowed with the sick and starving. The smell of decay filled the air, a constant reminder that the city was now a graveyard that hadn't finished burying its dead. Yet in the midst of despair, people still fought to live. Teachers held secret classes. Musicians gathered in basements to play stolen instruments. The human spirit, fragile as it was, refused to vanish entirely. Rumkowski's speeches became a regular ritual. He stood on balconies or inside assembly halls, addressing crowds that had no choice but to listen. His voice was sharp, commanding, tinged with desperation. "We must work," he declared. "Work is our only way to survive." Some believed him. Others despised him, calling him a puppet. But all were trapped in the same nightmare, bound to his system of labor by the promise, or illusion, of survival. The workshops began to multiply. What had once been homes and schools were converted into factories. Tailors sewed uniforms for German soldiers. Carpenters built wooden crates for ammunition. Shoemakers made boots stamped with the swastika. The ghetto became a massive production complex. Children as young as 10 worked long hours, hands raw from thread and leather. At night, the hum of machines filled the darkness like a mechanical prayer. Every stitch was a plea to live another day. Outside the wire, the German city of Litzmannstadt thrived. Cafes reopened, theaters played German songs, and shops displayed new goods made by the very people starving inside the ghetto. The contrast was obscene. One side of the fence filled with light and laughter, the other with silence and disease. German photographers occasionally entered the ghetto to document it, framing the misery through their lenses like a zoological exhibit. The images were sent to Berlin as proof that order had been established. The first months of the ghetto brought confusion, but also a grim sense of adaptation. The people began to develop routines, lining up for food, reporting to work, collecting ration cards, attending funerals that never ended. Children played with scraps of wood. Women mended old clothes into new ones. Men traded small items for potatoes. Even in captivity, life refused to stop. Yet everyone understood that this was not survival in any true sense. It was a holding pattern before an unknown end. Letters smuggled from the ghetto described the same thing again and again: hunger, fear, and disbelief. "It is a city of shadows," one man wrote, "where time no longer moves forward." The postal service was controlled by the Germans, and every message was censored, but even the censored words carried despair. Outside help was almost impossible. Polish resistance groups occasionally tried to smuggle food, but most of it was confiscated or lost. The fences made charity as dangerous as rebellion. In early April, The German authorities ordered all valuables and foreign currency to be surrendered. Those who resisted were publicly beaten. Gold teeth were extracted from corpses. The ghetto economy collapsed completely. In response, Rumkowski introduced a new form of currency, ghetto money printed with his signature, valid only inside the fences. It was worthless beyond them, a cruel symbol of isolation. Even time itself seemed different inside. Days blended together in a haze of hunger and exhaustion. The physical transformation of the ghetto was almost complete. Police gates controlled every entrance. Bridges were built to allow Germans to cross over Jewish streets without contact. The city that had once been a mosaic of cultures was now a divided landscape of power and powerlessness. German soldiers looked down from the bridges like gods observing another species. For those below, it was humiliation made permanent. By late April, when the last gates were locked, the ghetto population exceeded 160,000 souls. The remaining 70,000 Jews from nearby towns and villages were still being herded in. Trains arrived daily, each bringing new faces, new stories, new despair. The local population, already starving, was forced to make room for strangers. Space became a commodity more precious than gold. People slept standing up, shared beds, or lived in attics with no light or air. And yet, through it all, the machinery of labor continued to grow. Hans Bibo reported to Berlin that the Lodz Ghetto had become an efficient labor center. He spoke proudly of the profits generated by Jewish workers, of the textiles and boots sent to the Wehrmacht. In his mind, he had achieved something extraordinary, a system where people produced wealth for their captors while paying for their own imprisonment. The Nazi administration praised his initiative, but Bibo's reports did not mention the death toll. He didn't write about the children collapsing in the streets, or the men who died at their sewing machines, or the women who gave birth in corners with no water. He didn't note the suicides, the despair, the constant sound of coughing that filled the night. To the occupiers, those details were irrelevant. Only the numbers mattered. Output, cost, profit. The ghetto had become an equation where humanity was the variable most easily erased. Still, in secret, people documented everything. Teachers kept attendance lists from underground schools. Doctors wrote medical records with no medicine to prescribe. Journalists kept diaries, hiding them in walls and under floorboards. They knew that someday, someone would need to know. In that small act, the act of recording, there was rebellion. They refused to let the Nazis own their story. As spring approached, the snow melted into mud, and the smell of decay returned stronger than ever. The fences now looked permanent, their wooden posts darkened by rain and time. Children no longer asked when they would be allowed outside. They had forgotten what outside even meant. The city beyond the wire had become a rumor. Inside, a new normal had emerged, a world where labor was both the means and the trap of survival. And above it all stood Rumkowski, the self-proclaimed protector of his people, caught between power and guilt. He issued more decrees, organized more workshops, and spoke of building the future. But even he must have felt the chill in the air, the sense that this future was shrinking with each passing day. The ghetto was functioning exactly as the Germans intended, alive enough to work, weak enough to control. By the end of April 1940, the city of Lodz had vanished from the map of freedom. In its place stood Litzmannstadt, a factory of despair dressed as an experiment in efficiency. The people inside still dreamed of rescue, still believed that labor might earn them mercy. But the truth, though hidden behind polite German words and bureaucratic reports, was far darker. The ghetto had not been built to last forever. It had been built to prepare. And in the offices beyond the fences, plans were already being drawn for what came next. Trains, destinations, final measures. The ghetto was complete, but its purpose was only beginning to unfold. The hum of its factories, the rhythm of its workers, all of it was leading toward something no one inside could yet imagine. The walls that now held them were not only the edge of their world, they were the edge of extinction. Chapter 3. Mordecai Haim Rumkowski, the elder of the Jews. The ghetto had barely been sealed when one man began to emerge as both its architect and its prisoner. His name was Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski, a man of contradictions, ambition, and desperate conviction. To the Germans, he was a tool, a convenient intermediary between the oppressor and the oppressed. To his people, he was a paradox, savior to some, dictator to others, and to history, one of the most haunting figures of the Holocaust. His rule over the Lodz Ghetto would turn a prison into a system, one that gave the illusion of control while quietly feeding the machinery of destruction. Rumkowski was not a soldier or a politician. Before the war, he had run an orphanage in Lodz, known for his energy, his self-importance, and his passion for control. He dressed well, spoke loudly, and liked to be admired. When the Germans invaded, many in the Jewish community dismissed him as vain and eccentric. But when the occupiers demanded a Jewish leader who could carry out their decrees, Rumkowski's eagerness and bureaucratic skill made him the obvious choice. In October 1939, he was appointed by the Nazi administration as Der Altester Juden in Litzmannstadt, the elder of the Jews. In that moment, his life, and the fate of more than 200,000 others, changed forever. The title itself carried no clear definition. It was both a privilege and a curse. It meant authority without power, responsibility without freedom. Rumkowski quickly understood what the Germans expected: efficiency, obedience, and silence. But he also understood something else, that survival in this new world would depend on proving the ghetto's usefulness. If the Germans saw the Jews as indispensable labor, perhaps they would delay their annihilation. He clung to that logic like a drowning man clings to driftwood. From his office at the Judenrat headquarters on Limino-Skigo Street, Rumkowski began to build a city within a cage. He issued orders printed on gray paper, bearing his signature in sweeping blue ink. He formed departments, committees, and councils. There were divisions for food, labor, health, housing, education, even culture, a bureaucratic skeleton designed to make the ghetto function. Every street, every building, every person was documented, numbered, and categorized. In a place ruled by chaos, Rumkowski sought to impose order, his order. The first thing he established was control over labor. He believed that work was the only way to keep the Germans interested in keeping the Jews alive. "Our only path is production," he declared in one of his early speeches. "If we are useful, we shall live. If we are useless, we shall perish." His words echoed through the courtyards like a prayer and a warning. To some, they sounded like hope. To others, they were surrender dressed as strategy. Under his command, workshops multiplied. Homes were turned into factories, kitchens into sewing rooms, schools into carpentry shops. Men and women worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. They made boots, uniforms, metal fittings, brushes, and wooden crates for the German army. Children too young to work officially found ways to help, polishing buttons, sorting rags, carrying coal. The ghetto became a humming machine of survival, its rhythm dictated by Rumkowski's belief that labor was life. Yet every stitch, every nail hammered, was both resistance and submission. Rumkowski ruled the ghetto like a monarch. He walked through the streets, surrounded by guards from the Jewish police, his gray hair combed neatly, his face serious, eyes burning with something between conviction and pride. People were expected to bow as he passed. He issued his own currency, printed with his image. He had stamps made with his name. His portrait hung in offices and schools. To outsiders, this seemed grotesque, a man playing king in a kingdom of misery. But to those inside, it was more complicated. In a world stripped of dignity, even illusion could be a form of order. The Jewish police, officially known as the Ordnungsdienst, became Rumkowski's enforcers. They wore uniforms and carried batons. Their job was to maintain order, distribute rations, and carry out arrests when German orders arrived. Many were young men hoping that serving in uniform would keep them and their families safe. But soon, they were forced into tasks far darker, collecting the sick for deportation, breaking up protests, enforcing food ration laws. They became symbols of betrayal within the ghetto, yet few could imagine what it meant to live with such impossible choices. Rumkowski's speeches were unlike anything the ghetto had heard before. He spoke with grand gestures, his voice trembling with both authority and desperation. "I'm the father of this ghetto," he once declared, "and I must think for all of you." He compared himself to Moses leading his people through the desert. He demanded discipline, obedience, and silence. He forbade strikes and public complaints. "Every protest," he warned, "is a bullet against us." Some listened with faith, others whispered curses under their breath. But no one could ignore him. His voice was everywhere, on posters, in meetings, in the air itself. Yet beneath the speeches and structure, starvation deepened. By mid-1940, food rations were so meager that people boiled grass and potato peels. Bread was mixed with sawdust. Children fought over scraps dropped from horse carts. Rumkowski's administration tried to manage the crisis by opening communal kitchens, but it was never enough. The Germans deliberately starved the population to weaken resistance. Rumkowski's only tool against it was paperwork, ration cards, permits, production quotas. He believed if the system worked, lives could be extended. But the system itself was a trap designed by the occupiers, and no amount of efficiency could save everyone inside it. In private, witnesses said Rumkowski worked tirelessly. He slept little, held endless meetings, demanded reports on every department, every kilogram of flour, every bolt of fabric. He seemed driven by an almost messianic obsession with control. His aides described him pacing his office late into the night, murmuring calculations, drawing plans for new workshops. Yet, there were also moments of cruelty, sudden outbursts, humiliation of subordinates, punishment for those who questioned him. Power, in that enclosed world, became both armor and poison. In the summer of 1941, the ghetto's population reached its peak, over 200,000 Jews, including thousands deported from nearby villages. Overcrowding became unbearable. Epidemics spread. The hospitals overflowed, lacking medicine and soap. Rumkowski ordered the construction of new sanitary facilities and organized street cleaning brigades. He issued proclamations about hygiene, demanding citizens wash hands and sweep the streets. But how can anyone stay clean with no water, no soap, and bodies dying in the next room? Still, people obeyed, partly from fear, partly from the desperate human need to believe that small acts of order might hold back the chaos. Rumkowski also faced the Germans directly. His chief contact, Hans Bibo, saw him as a useful administrator, intelligent, compliant, and ambitious. Bibo often visited the ghetto, inspecting factories, demanding higher output. He praised Rumkowski's work, but reminded him that the entire ghetto existed only by the grace of German need. Every word of praise was edged with threat. Rumkowski learned to negotiate, to plead, to flatter. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it cost lives. Each meeting was a game played with loaded dice. To the outside world, the Lodz Ghetto appeared calm, efficient, and productive, exactly as the Germans wanted. But inside, life had become mechanical, stripped of warmth and time. People no longer spoke of months or seasons, only of ration days and work shifts. Weddings were rare, funerals constant. The sound of sewing machines replaced the laughter of children. The streets smelled of boiled turnips and coal smoke. And yet, within that monotony, moments of humanity still flickered. Neighbors shared crumbs. Musicians played forbidden songs. Poets wrote verses on scraps of paper, hiding them in walls. Life, however diminished, still refused to vanish completely. Rumkowski began to see himself as indispensable, the one man standing between survival and annihilation. This belief hardened into something almost divine. He demanded loyalty not only to his office, but to his person. "Without me," he told a group of workers, "you will all perish." He dismissed criticism as betrayal. When some accused him of collaborating too closely with the Germans, he responded coldly, "If obedience saves even one child, then I shall obey." But no one could agree on what was being saved anymore: lives, dignity, or just time. There were moments when his mask slipped. A secretary recalled seeing him weep after a meeting with Bibo, muttering that the Germans were asking for impossible things. Another aide remembered him raging, smashing a glass on his desk, shouting that he was fighting for ghosts. His mood swung between arrogance and despair. But whatever he felt in private, in public he remained the elder, the figure who could not show weakness. His voice became the only law that still functioned inside the wire. Then came the first deportations. In early 1942, the Germans ordered Rumkowski to prepare lists of non-essential workers for resettlement. The word resettlement was a lie, but many still wanted to believe it meant labor elsewhere. Rumkowski must have known better. Reports of mass killings in Chelmno were already circulating. Yet, faced with the demand, he complied. He believed that sacrificing some might save the rest. "We must cut off the gangrenous limb to save the body," he told his staff. It was a decision that would haunt his name forever. The deportations began in January. Each day, trucks and trains carried away thousands. The streets echoed with cries, with the sound of boots on cobblestone, with the metallic rattle of doors closing on cattle cars. Rumkowski stood at the center of it all, signing papers, giving orders, trying to keep control over the uncontrollable. He walked through the ghetto surrounded by the Jewish police, his face pale, his hands trembling. He told people to stay calm, to trust the process. Few did. Those who survived remembered him, standing in the square as families were torn apart. Some cursed him, others reached out, begging for his help. He tried to save orphans from deportation, but when the Germans demanded children, he delivered them himself. His infamous speech, "Give me your children," would come later, in September, but the seeds of it were already here, in those first lists, in those first trains. His vision of salvation through labor had met its terrible contradiction. The ghetto could only survive by feeding its own to the machine. Still, Rumkowski pressed on. He expanded the workshops, increased production, introduced new labor brigades. He began issuing ghetto coins to replace German currency, believing it would strengthen economic independence. He created schools that taught obedience and work discipline. He even established a small fire brigade and postal service. The ghetto became a grim imitation of a functioning city. But beneath the surface, the moral fabric was tearing apart. People traded secrets, bribed officials, stole ration cards. Survival turned everyone into negotiators of their own doom. By late 1942, the ghetto's population had been reduced by nearly half. Those who remained worked harder than ever, driven by Rumkowski's promise that labor would secure their lives. The workshops glowed late into the night, the air thick with heat and dust. Children slept beside machines. Women collapsed at their sewing tables. But production figures soared, and Bibo was pleased. The ghetto, he reported to Berlin, had become a model of Jewish productivity. Rumkowski read those words and believed them. He saw the survival of 60,000 people as proof that his strategy worked. Yet, in his heart, he must have known the truth, that he was managing a system designed for extinction. His authority rested entirely on the whim of his captors. One order from Berlin could erase everything he had built. But he kept going, perhaps because stopping meant facing what he had become. As winter returned, the ghetto grew quieter. Snow muffled the streets once more. The fences stood firm, the lights burned dim, and the elder of the Jews continued his work, surrounded by reports, petitions, and the sound of machines sewing uniforms for an army that was erasing his people. He had built an industry of survival, but its foundation was death. Outside the fences, the German war machine rolled on. Inside, Rumkowski's world balanced on the edge of madness. A kingdom of hunger ruled by a man who believed he could bargain with fate. He spoke of discipline, duty, and the future, but even his most loyal aides began to see the cracks. They whispered that the elder had started believing in his own myth, that he had confused survival with salvation. And yet, for all the moral fog, one fact remained. Without his system, the ghetto might have perished even sooner. That was the paradox of Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski, the man who tried to save his people by becoming part of their prison. His story would not end here. The worst was still to come. The Germans were not finished. They would soon demand what even Rumkowski could no longer rationalize. The next chapter would not be about labor or strategy. It would be about the unthinkable, the moment when survival itself became betrayal. Chapter 4: Hunger and Disease Behind the Fence, 1940 to 1941. It began with silence. When the last gate of the ghetto closed, the noise of the city beyond the fence vanished, leaving only the sound of footsteps, whispers, and wind. The people inside listened to that silence and knew what it meant. They were no longer citizens of Lodz. They were inmates in a city-sized prison. The fences had turned life itself into contraband. At first, there was disbelief. Some thought the Germans would open the gates again, that this was temporary. But days passed, then weeks. The guards stayed. The fences stayed. The people did not. They began to disappear, not through escape, but through hunger. Food became the single measure of existence. A loaf of bread could decide whether a man lived another day. A spoonful of soup could be the difference between strength and collapse. The official ration for Jews in the ghetto was starvation in numeric form. Less than 200 calories a day. Flour mixed with sawdust. Coffee made from roasted barley. Meat was a rumor. People boiled leather belts to soften them, chewed candle wax, scraped mold off bread, and ate it anyway. Rumkowski's administration tried to stretch the rations by opening communal kitchens, serving thin cabbage soup that smelled of smoke and despair. But no amount of rationing could change the math of death. People began to fall where they stood. The ghetto streets filled with the sounds of coughing. It was a sound that spread faster than gunfire. Typhus arrived first, carried by lice that thrive in overcrowded rooms where 6 or 7 families slept together on floors. Then came tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia. Doctors worked without medicine, using boiling water as disinfectant and chalk dust as powder. Hospitals overflowed. Beds were made from doors laid over bricks. There were no antibiotics, no anesthetics. Surgery was done by candlelight. Dr. Jakub Poznański, one of the ghetto's physicians, later wrote in his hidden journal that he could no longer tell whether he was treating the sick or simply recording the dying. The medical staff worked until they collapsed, then were replaced by others just as sick. There were moments of compassion. A nurse breaking her ration bread to feed a child, a doctor risking punishment to steal medicine from a German warehouse. But these acts could not stem the tide. Death had become routine. Funerals, once solemn, turned mechanical. Wooden carts rolled through the streets each morning, collecting bodies wrapped in rags or newspapers. Children learned not to look at them. The carts rattled toward the Jewish cemetery outside the ghetto fence, guarded by soldiers who smoked while the dead were counted and buried. Graves were dug in rows so long they disappeared into the horizon. In one early winter, the ground froze solid, and workers had to break it open with hammers. The sound of iron striking earth became the city's new heartbeat. And yet, through that endless hunger, life refused to stop entirely. Teachers continued to teach, scribbling lessons on scraps of paper. Classes were held in cellars, whispering so guards wouldn't hear. Mothers still sang lullabies, their voices trembling with fatigue. Artists sketched portraits of children whose faces were already ghost-like. Musicians played violins in the dark, their fingers thin as wire. It was not joy. It was defiance. Every note, every sketch, every whispered word was an act of resistance against a system that measured human worth in calories and labor hours. But the system was efficient. Rumkowski's administration reported deaths to the Germans with the same precision used for production figures. Names were replaced by numbers. Each month, the statistics arrived. Another 1,000 gone, another 1,000 registered as expired. The Germans prefer it that way. It turns suffering into data, tragedy into paperwork. And paperwork could be filed away. In this frozen city, time behaved differently. The seasons no longer mattered. The snow covered corpses in the streets, and when spring came, the thaw revealed them again. The air smelled of rot and burning wood. Rats multiplied faster than people. The ghetto, once a living part of Lodz, had become a separate ecosystem, closed, decaying, self-consuming. Rumkowski believed that order could still save them. He issued decree after decree. Citizens must sweep their streets, must wash hands, must report illness. He appointed sanitation brigades with armbands marked with his initials. They carried brooms instead of weapons. They moved through alleys collecting garbage, scrubbing walls, burning rags. It was a hopeless war against bacteria and despair, but even hopeless wars need soldiers. Those brigades worked until they fainted, sometimes dragging corpses they were too weak to bury. There was an odor to the ghetto that survivors would never forget. It was the smell of damp wood, coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and spoiled cabbage. It clung to everything: clothes, hair, skin. People stopped noticing it after a while. But for newcomers, deported from other towns, the stench was the first sign they had entered another world. By mid-1941, the Germans began sending Jews from Western Europe to Lodz, from Vienna, Prague, Berlin. They arrived with luggage, wearing overcoats and hats, some still believing they were being relocated for work. They carried violins, silverware, family photographs. When they saw the ghetto, most fell silent. The contrast between expectation and reality was unbearable. The locals, skeletal and ragged, looked at them like ghosts welcoming the newly dead. Within weeks, the newcomers looked the same. Rumkowski, still convinced that labor was the key to survival, ordered more workshops to be built to employ the new arrivals. The ghetto's economy expanded, even as its people starved. Textile factories ran day and night, producing uniforms and equipment for the Wehrmacht. The sound of sewing machines filled the air, thousands of needles stabbing fabric in mechanical rhythm, like the ticking of a clock that counted down to extinction. Work offered not comfort, but distraction. It kept the mind occupied, the body slightly fed. Workers received small rations, watery soup, a slice of bread. Those without jobs had nothing. They begged outside factory gates for crumbs, trading family heirlooms for potatoes. Sometimes they collapsed in the snow, clutching the bread they had just bought. The next morning, their bodies were gone, carted away with the rest. Even amid starvation, human hierarchy persisted. The ghetto developed its own classes: administrators with extra rations, factory foremen with privileges, black market traders who smuggled goods through hidden gaps in the fence. Envy and resentment grew, tearing at the fragile unity of the imprisoned population. Rumkowski's government became a miniature state of fear and corruption, sustained by its own bureaucracy and the illusion of choice. People whispered that one could live longer by serving close to the elder, by following orders, by keeping silent. The Jewish police became the most visible symbol of that silence. Once ordinary men, they now wore armbands and wielded authority. They confiscated goods, broke up gatherings, and enforced curfews. Some did it out of conviction, others simply to survive. But the uniform blurred the line between victim and collaborator. When they struck someone in the street, they were beating their own reflection. That was the cruelty of the ghetto. It forced people to become instruments of their own oppression. Children fared worst. Malnutrition twisted their growth. Their eyes grew enormous and hollow faces. They scavenged in garbage heaps, collecting potato skins and coffee grounds. Some crawled through holes in the fence to trade with Polish villagers, risking death for a handful of flour. Many never returned. Those who did spoke of German guards with rifles, of dogs trained to hunt them. Still, other children tried again the next day. Hunger made courage indistinguishable from madness. Inside homes, families learned to ration time as carefully as food. Breakfast was a sip of hot water. Lunch, a crust of bread. Dinner, nothing. The evenings were long and filled with whispers. Parents told their children stories about a world that no longer existed. Beaches, picnics, snow without fences. Sometimes the children asked when they would go back. The parents said soon, even though they knew the word had lost all meaning. The ghetto doctors continued to record everything. They documented symptoms, temperatures, weight loss, even causes of death when the cause was obvious: hunger. Their notebooks, later found buried under rubble, read like the anatomy of despair. One page lists the weight of a 10-year-old girl, 22 pounds. Another describes a man who starved so slowly that his hair turned white before he died. The Germans never censored these reports. They didn't need to. The reports only confirmed that the plan was working. And yet, beneath that horror, there were still sparks of resistance. Underground networks formed, passing news of the outside world. Smuggled newspapers reported on the war, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the British bombings, rumors that Hitler's armies might one day be defeated. Each piece of news traveled through whispers and scribbled notes. Hope was contraband, but it could not be fenced in. Cultural life, astonishingly, survived. Writers produced plays and poems, performing in secret basements. Artists painted on scraps of cardboard. One painter, Mendel Grossman, risked his life taking photographs with a hidden camera, documenting the truth that the Germans tried to bury. His images showed not propaganda, but humanity: a mother holding her child, a man collapsing at work, a child staring through the fence. Each photograph was a piece of stolen time. But survival had a price. Rumkowski's vision of work as salvation was beginning to erode. The death toll made the ghetto less productive. Workers collapsed on the job. The Germans complained about inefficiency. To restore order, Rumkowski increased working hours, reduced rest periods, and introduced strict discipline. He was fighting a losing battle against arithmetic. Fewer people meant less production, and less production meant less reason for the Germans to keep them alive. He tried to compensate with organization, with more meetings, more speeches. We must show them our value, he insisted. But the word value no longer meant human worth. It meant output. The Germans, satisfied with the economic results, tightened control anyway. New decrees arrived weekly. More confiscations, more restrictions. Radios were banned. Letters were censored. Any sign of hope was treated as resistance. The ghetto had become a laboratory of oppression, an experiment to see how long people could live without freedom, food, or dignity before they ceased to resist. By the end of 1941, the population of the ghetto had dropped sharply. Some had died of hunger, others of disease, others had been taken away for work, a phrase everyone now feared. The word had changed meaning. It no longer implied labor. It implied disappearance. Still, Rumkowski continued to preach work and obedience. To his followers, he promised endurance. To the Germans, he promised order. To himself, perhaps, he promised absolution. Outside, the world was changing. The war had widened. Hitler's forces were deep inside the Soviet Union, and new orders began to circulate among the German occupation offices. The final solution was being planned. The ghettos of Poland, once intended as holding pens, were now to become reservoirs of death. Lodz, with its fences and workshops, its ledgers and lists, was already the perfect model. It had proved that people could be turned into a workforce while awaiting extermination. But inside those fences, people still clung to life in defiance of that logic. They celebrated birthdays with crumbs of bread, exchanged poems as gifts, prayed in whispers. A woman who lost her entire family adopted 2 orphans. A tailor, dying of hunger, finished sewing his last uniform and smiled. "At least it will last longer than I will," he said. These small moments were invisible to the Germans, but history remembers them. They were proof that even in a world designed to erase humanity, humanity persisted. As 1941 gave way to 1942, the fences around the Lodz Ghetto seemed permanent. The guards rotated, but the rules did not. The people inside had learned to live with hunger as an old companion. Disease had taken its share. The rest waited, not for freedom, but for the next decree, the next list, the next train. And somewhere beyond the wire, the engines of Chelmno had already begun to hum. The first extermination camp in occupied Poland was being prepared less than 50 kilometers away. The paperwork that would send the first transports from Lodz was already being drafted in Hans Bibo's office. Rumkowski did not yet know it, but the illusion that work could save them was about to collapse. The city that had survived on labor and endurance was about to face a new horror, one that no speech, no ration card, no plan could delay. Hunger and disease had turned the ghetto into a graveyard. What came next would turn it into an abyss. Chapter 5. The Workshops of Survival. By the beginning of 1942, the Lodz Ghetto had settled into a rhythm of exhaustion. Every day began with the same sound: boots on cobblestones, the faint rattle of factory doors opening, the low groan of hunger. The fences were no longer new. They were a part of the landscape now, a horizon of wood and wire that framed every thought. Yet inside that cage, something extraordinary had happened. A city that had been starved, beaten, and humiliated had turned itself into an engine of labor. Not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Survival had become work. Work had become religion. And the ghetto's factories, its workshops of survival, were their temples. The idea came from two men: Hans Bibo, the German administrator who saw profit in misery, and Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski, the elder of the Jews, who saw salvation in obedience. Between them, they transformed the ghetto into what the Nazis called a production stat, a center of production. It was a grotesque kind of partnership. One man calculating profit margins in Reichsmarks, the other calculating the value of human life in hours worked. Bibo provided the materials, the orders, the quotas. Rumkowski provided the labor, tens of thousands of men, women, and children who worked themselves toward starvation to prove they were useful enough to live another day. Inside the ghetto's narrow streets, workshops bloomed like weeds. Every building, every courtyard, every basement became a factory. Tailors stitched military uniforms for German soldiers. Shoemakers repaired boots caked with Russian mud. Carpenters built ammunition crates, tables, and tool handles. Women embroidered insignias and flags they would never see flying. Even children were put to work, sorting buttons, folding fabric, sweeping floors. The air was filled with dust, sweat, and the constant drone of sewing machines that never seemed to stop. To the Germans, the ghetto had become efficient. To those inside, it was a miracle made of desperation. People who had lost their homes, their families, their faith, found purpose in work. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was momentum, the belief that as long as the machines kept turning, the deportations might stop. Rumkowski encouraged that belief with every speech. "We are an industrial city," he declared. "We must prove that we are indispensable. Our hands are our salvation." His words spread like oxygen through a room already choking. The workshops became both prison and refuge. Outside them, death waited in every alley. Inside, at least, there was motion. The workers could forget their hunger for a few hours. The rhythm of the machines became a kind of heartbeat, steady and hypnotic. Men leaned over sewing tables until their backs curved like hooks. Women stitched until their fingers bled. When the whistle blew at night, they returned home with eyes glazed and limbs trembling. Some carried extra scraps of fabric, hidden under coats, to patch clothes or barter for food. Every thread, every nail, every object carried the weight of a life prolonged. There was pride, too, strange and fragile, but real. People took ownership of their work, even when that work served the enemy. A tailor named Abraham wrote in his diary that he tried to sew each uniform as perfectly as possible. "If I do it well," he wrote, "maybe tomorrow they will still need me." That was the logic of the ghetto. Perfection as protection. The better you worked, the longer you lived. Laziness was suicide. Mistakes were death sentences. The Germans didn't need to enforce discipline with whips. Hunger did it for them. Hans Bibo watched the transformation with satisfaction. From his office outside the ghetto walls, He reported to Berlin that the Jewish laborers were productive and self-sustaining. He bragged that the ghetto required almost no external funding, that the workers paid for their own imprisonment through their output. He turned their suffering into an economic model, the Litzmanstadt system. He called it proof that Jews could be useful to the Reich. In truth, it was proof of how far human endurance could be twisted before it broke. Inside the ghetto, Rumkowski oversaw everything. He signed work permits, allocated labor quotas, assigned supervisors. He built entire administrative departments dedicated to tracking production. Every spool of thread, every hammer, every piece of leather was counted. He dreamed of turning the ghetto into a permanent industrial colony, a city that the Germans would never destroy because it was too valuable. He spoke of it as if it were a divine mission. Our work, he said, will be our wall of defense. But that wall was built from exhaustion, and each day it crumbled a little more. In the early months of 1942, the ghetto's industrial output reached record levels. The workshops produced uniforms for the Luftwaffe, wooden parts for military vehicles, gloves, belts, caps, and even toys for German children. Some of these items were marked with small tags that read, "Made in Litzmanstadt." It was a cruel irony. The people who were being erased from existence were making gifts for the children of their killers. But in the warped world of the ghetto, irony no longer mattered. Only survival did. The wages were paid not in money, but in food. A worker received an extra ration of bread, a thin soup with a few pieces of potato, sometimes even a small portion of margarine. It was barely enough to live on, but it was something. Those without work received nothing. As a result, the competition for jobs became brutal. Families begged Rumkowski's officials for work permits, offering jewelry, furniture, anything they still owned. Mothers offered to work in place of their children. Children lied about their age to be hired. The line between labor and life had disappeared completely. The workshops became the new centers of power. Supervisors wielded influence over life and death, deciding who would be hired, who would be fired, who would eat. Corruption grew like mold. Bribes were common. A piece of bread for a better job, a button for a favor, a smile for mercy. Rumkowski tried to root it out with speeches and punishments, but even he knew that hunger made saints impossible. The ghetto was not a moral society. It was a society of survival. Still, amidst the grime and cruelty, there were flashes of humanity. Workers shared crumbs, protected one another, and whispered jokes to keep from collapsing. One musician brought his violin to the factory and played softly during lunch breaks, his bow gliding over the strings like a heartbeat. Others sang old Yiddish songs under their breath while sewing, remembering lives that now seemed to belong to another century. These small acts didn't change the world, but they reminded people that they were still human. By late 1942, the ghetto had become one of the most productive labor centers in occupied Poland. German officers toured the factories, impressed by their efficiency. They saw rows of starving workers bent over machines and mistook it for order. They saw silence and mistook it for discipline. Bibo praised Rumkowski as a model administrator. Rumkowski accepted the praise, though it burned him inside. He knew that for every uniform completed, a life was being traded. But he couldn't stop. His entire philosophy, the idea that labor could save them, depended on keeping those machines running. The illusion of stability lasted longer in Lodz than in other ghettos. While Warsaw burned with rebellion, Lodz remained eerily calm. Rumkowski forbade uprisings, believing that defiance would bring annihilation. "We are not soldiers," he said. "We are workers. We must endure." Many hated him for it. Others quietly agreed. They had seen what happened to those who resisted. For now, the ghetto still breathed, and breathing was enough. But the cost of that endurance was staggering. The workers' health deteriorated rapidly. The average life expectancy in the ghetto fell below 35. Bodies withered into shadows of themselves. Fingers twisted from cold and overuse. Eyes sank deep into skulls. People moved like ghosts, their minds dulled by fatigue. A doctor later described them as living skeletons held together by will alone. Even the children stopped playing. They sat quietly in corners, watching the adults as if trying to understand what life was supposed to mean. The ghetto's internal propaganda machine tried to keep spirits up. Posters proclaimed, "Work brings bread." Rumkowski's speeches promised better rations and medical aid that never came. He walked through the workshops in his tailored coat, inspecting the workers, offering words of encouragement. Some greeted him with applause, others looked away. His presence brought both comfort and resentment. To some, he was the reason they still had jobs. To others, he was the reason they were still prisoners. At night, the factories glowed with dim light from oil lamps. The sound of machines filled the darkness, clacking, humming, whispering like distant thunder. In those hours, the ghetto seemed alive, defiant, unstoppable. But when the morning came, the illusion broke. The smell of death returned. The hospital carts rolled by. The numbers of the dead kept rising. For every worker who survived another day, 2 more were buried. In his reports to Berlin, Bibo wrote that the Lodz Ghetto was a success. He boasted of profits, of low maintenance costs, of productive discipline. He did not mention the funerals, the hunger, or the silence that hung over the city like fog. The Nazis were pleased. The ghetto had proven that the Jews could be contained, controlled, and exploited indefinitely. It was an industrial model of oppression, efficient, profitable, and invisible. But no system built on death can last forever. Beneath the surface of order, cracks were forming. The workers were too weak to sustain production. Machines broke from overuse. Supplies ran short. And outside the fence, in Berlin and Warsaw, new orders were being written, orders that would make all of Rumkowski's careful planning meaningless. The factories of survival had bought them time, but time was running out. As 1942 drew to a close, the ghetto stood at its most deceptive point. On paper, it was thriving, a miracle of endurance. In reality, it was dying in slow motion. Hunger still ruled, disease still stalked the streets, and now rumors began to spread again. People whispered about Chelmno, about deportations that were not resettlements but executions. They said the trains did not stop anywhere, that those sent away never returned. Rumkowski dismissed the rumors publicly, but privately, he was haunted by them. He knew that if the Germans ever decided the ghetto was no longer useful, all the work in the world would not save them. Still, the machines kept turning. Because what else was there to do? To stop would be to surrender. So they worked, day after day, night after night. Sewing, hammering, cutting, stitching, surviving. The sound of labor became the sound of prayer, the only rhythm left to believe in. The workshops were more than factories now. They were memorials in motion, monuments to endurance. Every piece of cloth, every crate, every shoe carried the fingerprints of those who refused to vanish quietly. And then, as winter fell again, the snow covered the rooftops of the ghetto, muffling the sounds within. The fences stood white and silent. The machine slowed for a moment before roaring back to life. Inside, people worked until their hands bled, until their eyes blurred, until they could no longer tell whether the day was ending or beginning. They did it not out of loyalty to Rumkowski or to the Germans, but because it was all they had left, movement against oblivion. Outside the wire, the war was changing. The German army was retreating from Moscow, and whispers of Soviet victories reached even the ghetto's prisoners. Some dared to hope that liberation might come before the end. Others no longer believed in rescue. They had learned that the world beyond the fence moved on without them. Still, they worked, because to stop was to die. The Lodz Ghetto had become a city without freedom, but not without purpose. Its workshops were its heartbeat, its last defense against extinction. But the same hands that kept the machines alive were building their own chains, creating goods that strengthened the very army that held them captive. It was the cruelest paradox of all, an industry of survival that served death. And soon, that paradox would collapse. The Germans would no longer need the workers once they had enough uniforms, enough crates, enough proof of obedience. The workshops would fall silent, the machines would rust, and the people who had filled them with life would be told to pack their belongings for resettlement. The next chapter of the ghetto story would not be written in labor reports or production quotas. It would be written in ashes and silence. The machines had bought them time, but time was the one thing the Germans had never promised to give. Chapter 6: The Nazi Administration and Hans Bibo. In every empire of cruelty, there are men who destroy with guns, and there are men who destroy with paper. Hans Bibo was one of the latter. He never fired a weapon inside the Lodz Ghetto. He didn't need to. His pen did the killing for him. Behind the fences where hunger and disease devoured the living, his office thrived, clean, warm, efficient. From his desk, he turned human beings into ledgers, hunger into statistics, and death into profit. The ghetto was not simply a camp to him. It was a business venture, and he ran it like a man proud of his own genius. Before the war, Bibo had been a businessman in Bremen, a coffee merchant, trained in accounting and logistics. He knew supply chains, margins, productivity. When the Nazis invaded Poland, men like him became indispensable. They didn't wear blood on their sleeves. They wore uniforms of paperwork. Bibo arrived in Lodz in 1940 as the German administrator of the Jewish ghetto, a post that combined the power of a governor, a banker, and a warden. It was his job to make the ghetto profitable, to turn starvation into production. In that cold calculus, he excelled. He studied the ghetto like a machine in need of maintenance. Every worker was a cog, every loaf of bread an input, every corpse an expected loss. He hired clerks, engineers, and accountants to help him streamline the process. The numbers fascinated him. If 100 workers produced 1,000 uniforms a week, he wanted 200 workers producing 3,000. If one ration of bread kept a worker alive long enough to finish a quota, then one ration was all they would get. It was not cruelty, he said. It was efficiency. To the Nazis, Lodz, renamed Litzmannstadt, was supposed to be a model colony of German order. To achieve that, Bibo transformed the ghetto into what he proudly called a self-financing enterprise. He boasted to Berlin that the Jews paid for their own imprisonment, their food, their guards, even the maintenance of the barbed wire that held them in. The system sustains itself, he wrote. He wasn't lying. By 1942, the ghetto's industries were turning a profit for the Reich. Every uniform, every boot, every wooden crate shipped out of Lodz carried not just German goods but the slow, invisible death of those who made them. Bibo ruled with a strange, polite cruelty. He was not loud or violent. He preferred smiles to shouts, signatures to bullets. He visited the ghetto often, walking through workshops with his hands clasped behind his back, nodding approvingly at the rows of exhausted workers. He would speak in a calm tone, asking about production targets, about raw materials. He rarely looked anyone directly in the eye. To him, they were not people but components in his operation. The workers bowed their heads, whispering his name, as if he were some distant, dangerous god. He had his favorites, skilled craftsmen, administrators who made his work easier. Rumkowski was one of them. The elder of the Jews was both his partner and his shield. Through Rumkowski, Bibo could issue orders without ever appearing responsible for them. Deportations became transfers. Starvation became rations. Death became reduction in population. The language was clean, almost scientific. Each word stripped away what it described. That was Bibo's real genius. Not an invention, but an erasure. When he wrote to his superiors, his tone was proud, efficient, and detached. The productivity of the Litzmannstadt ghetto has exceeded expectations, he reported in one memo. The Jewish labor force functions with discipline under minimal supervision. Output in textiles and leather goods has increased by 17% this quarter. He never mentioned that the increase came from men collapsing at their machines or from children too hungry to cry. To him, human suffering was noise in the background of progress. He wasn't a sadist in the cinematic sense. He didn't beat prisoners for sport. He didn't attend executions with glee. He didn't need to. His cruelty was structural. It lived in the system he built, a system that turned every act of survival into an act of submission. He created a world where life itself was the product being consumed. He gave the Nazis what they wanted: order, output, and silence. To the Jews inside the ghetto, his name became a whisper of dread. People said, "Bibo has ordered new inspections," and hearts would sink. Inspections meant cuts to rations, new deportation lists, or worse, efficiency adjustments, as he called them. He walked through the gates in his polished boots, his uniform spotless, his hair neatly combed, inspecting misery as though it were inventory. He sometimes stopped to compliment a craftsman's work. He told one worker that his boots were excellent, almost German in quality. That man was dead within a month, starved to death, his body tossed into a mass grave. Bibo believed in his own myth. He saw himself as a businessman doing his duty, not a murderer. After the war, he would claim he had helped the Jews survive longer by keeping the ghetto productive. But every decision he made shortened their lives. He cut food rations to balance budgets. He denied medical supplies to save money. He refused to allow the sick to rest because idle hands do not contribute. To him, death was not tragedy, it was cost reduction. His office, located just outside the ghetto walls, became the nerve center of the operation. Stacks of papers covered his desk: ration reports, production schedules, transportation manifests. On one wall hung a map of the ghetto marked with pins and colored lines showing factory zones. Another wall displayed charts of production targets, rising steadily year after year. He treated that map the way an artist treats a canvas, a creation of his own genius. But the paint was blood, and the masterpiece was misery. He often met with Rumkowski, their meetings recorded in dry bureaucratic language. They discussed quotas, materials, workforce needs. Rumkowski would argue for more food, more coal, more medicine, trying to keep his people alive. Bibo would nod, take notes, and agree to minor concessions that changed nothing. He always reminded Rumkowski of his goodwill. He said, "Herr Altester, I am on your side. I want the ghetto to succeed." What he didn't say was that success meant productivity, not life. When the deportations began in 1942, Bibo managed them like logistics. He received orders from Berlin to reduce the population by 50,000. He treated it like a supply chain problem: trains, schedules, coordination. He met with transport officials, arranged fuel for the locomotives, ensured the loading platforms at Reich gas station were efficient. He even supervised the inventory of confiscated belongings from those being sent away: shoes, coats, pots, rings. Those goods were cleaned, repaired, and sold back to German civilians. Nothing was wasted, not even death. He watched the trains leave the station without emotion. To him, it was another shipment completed. The cars were full, the paperwork signed, the job done. The destination, Chelmno, was not his concern. That was someone else's department. That's how bureaucracy murders, not through hatred, but through division of labor. Everyone does their part, and no one sees the whole. Bibo's relationship with the other German officials in Lodz was one of rivalry and mutual disdain. The Gestapo saw him as soft. He saw them as brutish. He preferred control through management, not terror. But his calmness was a mask. When orders from Berlin were ignored or delayed, his temper flared. He shouted at his subordinates, accusing them of inefficiency. He cared more about production quotas than lives. When typhus outbreaks threatened to slow work, he ordered entire buildings burned, their inhabitants evacuated, not to save them, but to protect the machinery of labor. His office was surrounded by comfort, good wine, clean linen, music from the radio. From his window, he could see the rooftops of the ghetto workshops, the smoke rising from their chimneys. That smoke, to him, was proof of success. To those inside, it was the smell of starvation. The contrast was unbearable, yet it was the world he had built. One man's efficiency measured against another's extinction. Even as the war dragged on, Bibo's confidence never faltered. He believed the ghetto would last forever. He saw it as his personal creation, a model of Nazi administration, a place where Jews had been transformed from citizens into resources. He called it the best managed ghetto in Europe. And in a perverse way, he was right. Lodz outlasted every other ghetto in occupied Poland. It remained functional until 1944, not because of mercy, but because of profit. That illusion of permanence was shattered in the summer of 1944, when the order came to liquidate the ghetto. The Red Army was approaching from the east, and Himmler demanded that all remaining Jews be deported to Auschwitz. When Bibo received the directive, witnesses said he went pale. Not out of sympathy, out of fear. His empire was ending. His workers, his profits, his power, all about to vanish. He begged his superiors to delay the liquidation. The ghetto is still productive, he argued. It serves the Reich. But his words carried no weight anymore. The logic of profit had been replaced by the logic of annihilation. In July, the trains began again. Bibo personally oversaw the deportations, standing on the platform with his clipboard, counting each person as if they were crates. He promised them work in Germany, told them they would be relocated to better facilities. Many believed him, not because they trusted him, but because they had nothing else to believe in. They boarded the trains quietly, holding what few belongings they had left. The doors slammed shut. The engines roared. The trains moved toward Auschwitz. By the end of August, the ghetto was silent. The workshops were empty. The machines had stopped. Bibo walked through the deserted streets, inspecting the ruins of his creation. He later said it felt strangely quiet. He couldn't comprehend it. For 4 years, this place had been his life's work, his grand experiment in efficiency. Now it was gone, erased in a few weeks. The silence that followed was his true legacy. When the Red Army liberated Lodz in January 1945, they found only a few hundred survivors hiding in attics and cellars. The rest, over 200,000, were dead. The city that had once hummed with labor was now a graveyard. Bibo fled to Germany, where he tried to disappear into civilian life. But history has a way of finding its accountants. In 1947, he was captured by Allied authorities and extradited to Poland. During his trial in Lodz, he sat in the same city where his victims had starved. Witnesses described his calm demeanor, his meticulous memory for numbers, his insistence that he had done good work. He claimed he had saved lives by keeping the ghetto open. The court saw through him. His defense, the same defense of every bureaucrat of genocide, was obedience. "I was only following orders," he said. The judges called it what it was: participation in mass murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On June 23, 1947, in the courtyard of the Lodz prison, Hans Bibo was hanged. Witnesses said he faced his executioners with the same cold composure he had shown his victims. The man who had built a city of slavery died in silence, his body dropping into the same earth that held the bones of those he had destroyed. But his system, the idea that cruelty could be managed, that murder could be efficient, did not die with him. It survived in the ledgers, in the files, in the logic that turned life into numbers. That was his real contribution to history. He proved that genocide didn't need rage to function. It only needed order, organization, and men like him who believed that doing their job well was all that mattered. For the survivors of the ghetto, his name would always be synonymous with quiet evil. The man who smiled while they starved, who counted their labor and called it progress. His world was gone, but its ghosts remained, lingering in the ruins of the workshops where the hum of machines had once drowned out the cries of the dying. The fences were gone now, the barbed wire torn down, but the outlines of his empire still scarred the city. The empty courtyards, the cracked walls, the faint traces of numbers still painted on the doors of abandoned factories. They were the fingerprints of a man who had turned death into an industry and called it administration. And in that silence that followed his fall, the world began, slowly, to understand what his kind of order truly meant. Chapter 7: Deportations to Chelmno, January, May 1942. The new year did not arrive in the Lodz ghetto with celebration. It came instead with rumors. whispers that carried through courtyards, through the lines at the soup kitchens, through the factories where workers stitched and hammered in silence. People spoke of trains, of villages emptied overnight, of Germans calling it resettlement. The word sounded harmless, even hopeful. But the older ones, those who had seen the Germans before, knew that the Nazis never built trains for mercy. The rumor had a name, and that name would soon become synonymous with annihilation: Chelmno. In January 1942, the ghetto still seemed alive on the surface. The workshops buzzed with noise, Rumkowski gave his speeches, and Hans Bibo sent glowing reports to Berlin about increased production. But beneath that mechanical order, the tension was unbearable. The people were exhausted, their bodies wasting away from hunger, their eyes hollowed by fear. They could feel something shifting in the air. A new phase of cruelty was beginning, colder and more efficient than before. The first official announcement came in the early days of January. The Germans ordered the deportation of 10,000 Jews from the ghetto. The reason given was resettlement to work in the East. Rumkowski read the decree aloud, his voice trembling but steady. He told the people to obey, to cooperate, to trust that those who worked would remain safe. He said it as if he believed it, but inside he must have known the truth was darker. Outside the ghetto, just 50 kilometers away, the Nazis had built something unprecedented, a killing center disguised as a transit camp. It was called Chelmno. It was not a concentration camp in the old sense. There were no barracks, no long lists, no registrations. Only arrival, deception, and death. Victims were told they would bathe before continuing to labor camps. They were stripped, herded into vans, and killed with exhaust fumes. Their bodies were buried in the forest nearby. It was the prototype for the final solution, the first industrialized death factory in Europe. But the people of Lodz didn't know that. Not yet. When the first transports were announced, families began to pack what little they had: blankets, food scraps, photographs. Mothers sewed coins into hymns. Fathers whispered prayers. They lined up at Reich gas station under the supervision of the Jewish police and German guards. It was bitterly cold, the ground frozen solid, the air thick with the smell of coal and fear. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, asking where they were going. The answer was always the same: east. Rumkowski stood by the station that day, watching as the trains filled. He told people to stay calm, that they would be reunited later. Some cursed him, others begged him to let them stay. He promised to protect the rest of the ghetto by complying with the German order. "If we disobey," he said, "they will destroy us all." His words echoed the logic that had guided him from the beginning: survival through obedience, order in exchange for life. But now that logic was turning against him. The trains left one after another, their wheels screeching against the frozen tracks. Inside, hundreds were crammed into cattle cars, standing shoulder to shoulder, pressed against the walls. Some suffocated before the train even reached its destination. Those who survived the journey arrived at a clearing surrounded by trees. There, SS men greeted them with polite efficiency. They were told to leave their luggage in neat piles, to undress for disinfection. No one understood until it was too late. The engines of the vans started, their hum blending with the winter wind. Within minutes, the sound faded, and silence returned. Back in the ghetto, the empty rooms began to multiply. Neighbors vanished overnight. Entire families disappeared. The workshops lost workers. The schools lost children. Rumkowski's administration tried to fill the gaps with new laborers, but the losses were impossible to ignore. He called emergency meetings with Bibo, begging for answers. Bibo smiled and said the deportations were part of population adjustments. He assured Rumkowski that the productive core of the ghetto would remain untouched. But his eyes betrayed him. He knew exactly what was happening in Chelmno. By February, the scale of the deportations had increased. Each week, more trains left Reich gas station, carrying thousands. The ghetto police, under orders, assisted with the roundups. They went door to door, collecting names, dragging the sick and the elderly from their beds. Some officers cried as they worked. Others hardened themselves, telling the victims it was only temporary. The streets filled with carts carrying bundles of possessions that would never be reclaimed. Children screamed for their parents as the gates closed behind them. The deportations targeted the weakest first, the elderly, the sick, those unable to work. Rumkowski believed that by sacrificing them, he could save the rest. He called it selective compliance, a term that would haunt his name forever. He gave speeches urging the young and able to remain calm, to continue working, to prove their worth. Only through labor can we survive, he repeated. But by then, even his own officials whispered that labor had lost its power to protect. The Germans had moved beyond exploitation. Now they wanted erasure. Inside the workshops, the workers heard the trains every morning. The low, distant rumble was unmistakable. They tried not to look up, tried to keep sewing, hammering, cutting. But the sound carried through the air like an accusation. Each time it came, someone would whisper, "Another transport." The word Chelmno began to circulate more openly. Stories leaked through, of trucks filled with exhaust fumes, of forests filled with graves. Some refused to believe them. "It's impossible," they said. Even the Germans wouldn't do that. But impossibility had long since lost its meaning. The cemeteries filled faster than ever before. The mortality rate inside the ghetto doubled as food rations shrank. The Germans diverted supplies to the war front, leaving the ghetto to starve. Rumkowski's officials rationed bread down to slices measured by weight. Workers fainted at their machines, were dragged away, replaced by others. And still, the trains kept coming. Each departure left the ghetto more hollow, more ghostly. In March, the Nazis ordered another wave of deportations, this time including orphan children. Rumkowski protested, arguing that the orphans were productive, that they worked in tailoring workshops, cleaning uniforms for the army. Bibo pretended to sympathize, but refused to intervene. "Orders from Berlin," he said, "cannot be changed." Rumkowski tried a bargain, offering to increase output, to cut rations further, to make the ghetto even more self-sufficient. It was useless. The machinery of death no longer needed efficiency. It needed bodies. The Jewish police began rounding up children from orphanages. Some officers refused and were executed on the spot. The screams echoed through the courtyards as mothers tried to hide their sons and daughters under beds, inside closets, behind false walls. German soldiers dragged them out, kicking and shouting. Rumkowski's authority crumbled in those moments. His words meant nothing against the rifles. The ghetto was no longer a place of labor. It was a reservoir of victims being drained methodically. By April, the reality could no longer be denied. The deportations were not resettlement. They were extermination. Survivors from Chelmno escaped and brought back the truth. They described the gas vans, the bodies piled in pits, the smell of burning flesh. The news spread through the ghetto like a fire without sound. People stopped packing for deportation. They stopped hoping for letters. They understood at last that the trains did not lead to life. They led to smoke. Rumkowski faced an impossible choice. To resist meant destruction. To comply meant complicity. He chose the latter, believing that saving part of the community was better than losing all of it. He tried to convince himself that the deportations were inevitable, that his role was to minimize the suffering. But as the months passed, even he began to break. He stopped sleeping. He walked the streets at night, silent and hollow-eyed, avoiding the gaze of those who once called him their protector. The title Elder of the Jews had become a curse. By May, more than 55,000 people had been deported from the Lodz Ghetto to Chelmno. None returned. The streets that once overflowed with life were half empty now. Entire blocks stood abandoned. The workshops still functioned, but they echoed with absence. Workers filled the gaps left by the missing, their machines clicking in rhythm with despair. The illusion of order remained, but it was an order built on graves. Even Hans Bibo began to sense the change. The ghetto that had once been his economic triumph was now collapsing. The labor force was shrinking too fast. Production slowed. Profits fell. He sent frantic reports to Berlin, urging them to halt the deportations before the workforce disappeared entirely. The ghetto's productivity is being undermined, he wrote. But his superiors no longer cared. The logic of extermination had overtaken the logic of profit, and so the transports continued. Day after day, the trains departed under gray skies, carrying away the last illusions of survival. The sound of the engines became the anthem of death. The children's shoes left behind at the station formed small mountains of silence. Each shoe was a name, a story, a heartbeat that had stopped. When the final transport left in May, the ghetto seemed frozen in time. The fences still stood, the guards still patrolled, but the people inside moved like shadows. They no longer believed in speeches or salvation. They worked because it was the only thing left to do. Work had become their mourning. Every needle-piercing cloth was a prayer for the dead. Every hammer strike was an act of remembrance. Rumkowski gathered his officials for one last meeting that spring. Witnesses said he looked older, his face pale, his voice barely audible. He told them that the ghetto must carry on, that they must rebuild, that they must fill the workshops again. "We are still alive," he said, "and as long as we work, we have meaning." No one applauded. The silence that followed was heavier than any speech. Outside, the trains faded into memory. The tracks at Reich were empty now, glistening with rain. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke from the west. In the distance, the forests around Chelmno were filled with the remains of a vanished people. Tens of thousands of lives extinguished in less time than it took to harvest a season's crop. The Lodz Ghetto remained, but it was no longer a community. It was a shell, a factory without laughter, a city without childhood, a graveyard disguised as labor. The deportations had accomplished what starvation and disease could not. They had turned survival itself into an act of mourning. Those who remained lived with the knowledge that every breath they took was borrowed from the dead. And as summer approached, the factories resumed their rhythm. The machines clattered, the needles moved, and the air filled again with the sound of industry. But this was not the same hum as before. It was slower, emptier, haunted. Every sound echoed the same question: how long until the next train? No one knew it then, but the ghetto had entered its most deceptive phase. It looked stable again, efficient, productive. But beneath that thin layer of order lay something irrevocably broken. The Germans had discovered that even destruction could be organized, and the Jews of Lodz had learned that even survival could become a form of dying. The trains to Chelmno had changed everything. They had proven that there was no bargain left to make, no logic that could explain the cruelty, no work that could guarantee another dawn. And yet, the survivors of the deportations continued to rise each morning, walk to their factories, and pick up their tools. Because in a world where everything had been taken, the act of continuing to live, even for one more day, had become the last rebellion left. Chapter 8. The Sperre. The Great Deportation of September 1942. The ghetto had already been hollowed out by months of deportations, but what came in September 1942 broke even the illusion of survival that had held the people of Lodz together. The air that month felt heavier, the streets quieter, as if the entire city was holding its breath. It began with a single announcement, carried through loudspeakers mounted on poles. Every inhabitant of the ghetto was to remain inside their homes. No one was to go to work. No one was to leave their street. German soldiers and the Jewish police would conduct inspections. The word they used was Sperre, blockade. To the people inside, it meant something far worse. It meant selection. It meant death. By early September, the summer's warmth had begun to fade. The ghetto was already weakened from hunger and loss, but that morning felt different. The streets were empty, the air strangely still, the sky a dull gray that seemed to press down on the city. At dawn, the first German trucks arrived, filled with soldiers and SS men. Behind them came the Jewish police, their armbands pale against their dark uniforms, their faces drawn and grim. Loudspeakers barked orders. Everyone was to stay indoors until called. The inspection, they said, would be quick. No one believed them. Rumkowski had known something was coming. For weeks, he had received warnings from Hans Bibo and the German administration. The ghetto, they said, was too full of unproductive mouths, the old, the sick, and the children. The orders from Berlin were clear. A reduction was required. The ghetto must be cleansed of all who could not work. Rumkowski begged, pleaded, argued. He offered to double production, to open new factories, to starve his people further if necessary. Nothing mattered. The decision had already been made. The Germans wanted 20,000 deported. They didn't care who. On the morning of September 5th, Rumkowski stood on a wooden platform in the middle of Marieson Square. Thousands gathered to hear him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. When he began to speak, his voice cracked under the weight of what he had to say. A grievous blow has struck the ghetto, he began. They're demanding from us the sacrifice of the most precious thing we possess, our children. The crowd froze. Some screamed. Others simply collapsed where they stood. Rumkowski raised his hands, begging for silence. Mothers and fathers, he continued, give me your children. Do not think it is easy for me. I must cut off the limbs to save the body. His words hung in the air like smoke. No one could breathe. That speech would become one of the most haunting moments in the history of the Holocaust. People would argue for decades about what it meant, whether Rumkowski was trying to save the ghetto by complying, or whether he had already surrendered his soul. But in that moment, all that mattered was the sound of crying, thousands of voices rising at once, echoing through the square, carrying the sound of human heartbreak to the gray sky above. The next day, the Germans began their operation. Trucks rolled through the streets, stopping at every corner. Soldiers and police went door to door, pulling people from their homes. The young and strong were ordered to one side, the elderly, the sick, the children to the other. Those who resisted were shot on the spot. The streets filled with noise, boots, shouts, screams, the thud of doors being kicked open. Mothers tried to hide their children in cupboards, in basements, under piles of rags. Some gave their sons girls' clothes, hoping to disguise them. Others fed their babies sleeping pills, praying the Germans would think they were dead. The Jewish police moved through the ghetto like ghosts, faces pale with shame. Many of them had children of their own. Some refused to help and were beaten. Others obeyed, telling themselves they had no choice. They went house to house with German officers, carrying out orders they could barely say aloud. One policeman later wrote in his diary that the sound of mothers screaming would never leave him. It was as if the city itself was dying, he wrote. The hospitals were cleared first. Patients too weak to move were dragged from their beds. Doctors begged the Germans to spare them, to allow the sick to stay, but their pleas were ignored. Nurses clung to their patients until they were torn away. The hospital courtyard became a place of chaos. Bodies, blankets, blood on the cobblestones. When the trucks filled up, the Germans shot the remaining patients where they lay. In the orphanages, the scene was worse. Children screamed and clung to each other, calling out for mothers who were already gone. Some tried to run, others hid under beds, but there was nowhere to go. The German soldiers laughed as they pulled them out by their arms and legs. Rumkowski himself was present at one of the orphanages, trying to maintain order, urging the children to stay calm. He promised them they were being taken to a better place. He was crying as he said it. Witnesses remembered him walking beside the trucks as they departed, his hand raised in blessing, his face pale with horror. For 7 days, the operation continued. The ghetto became a hunting ground. Every morning, the trucks arrived. Every evening, they left filled with the condemned. German soldiers searched attics and basements, using bayonets to probe piles of debris. The smell of fear hung over the city. Children tried to flee through holes in the fence, but were caught and shot. Others were hidden in chimneys, in sewers, in the walls of buildings. Some survived by miracles, most did not. In one building on Brzezinska Street, a mother hid her 5-year-old son inside a flour sack. When the soldiers came, she stood in front of it, trembling. They pushed her aside, stabbed the sack with a knife, and left without opening it. The boy survived, coated in flour. unable to speak for days. Stories like his became rare jewels of hope in a sea of despair. For every child saved, hundreds were lost. The deportations were methodical. Each district was sealed one by one. The Germans recorded the numbers with precision. In some areas, the Jewish police were forced to collect the bodies of those shot in the streets. The dead were piled into carts and taken to the cemetery, where gravediggers worked day and night. The ground was so full that new graves were dug between old ones, stacked on top of each other. The smell of decay mixed with the smell of burning wood from the workshops, still trying to function. Life and death coexisted, divided only by the thickness of a wall. By the middle of the week, the ghetto was collapsing under the weight of grief. Work had stopped. The factories were silent. People sat in doorways, staring blankly at the empty streets. Rumkowski continued to give orders, his voice a whisper of authority in a world that no longer believed in it. He sent appeals to Bibo, begging him to halt the deportations. Bibo ignored him. The numbers were already set. By the time the Sperre ended, 15,000 children, the sick, and the elderly had been taken away. The trains that carried them followed the same route as before, ending in Chelmno. There, the process was swift. The victims were told to undress, to leave their clothes neatly folded, to take a shower. The gas vans were already waiting. Within minutes, they were dead. Their bodies were dumped into mass graves in the surrounding forest. The efficiency of it all was horrifyingly precise. The Germans had turned extermination into administration. Back in the ghetto, the silence was unbearable. The streets that once echoed with the sounds of children's laughter were empty. The schools were closed. The orphanages were gone. Parents wandered the alleys in a daze, calling names that would never be answered. Teachers gathered in the evenings to mourn their students. In one building, someone wrote on the wall in chalk, "Here lived children who no longer live." The rain washed it away a few days later, but the memory of it lingered. Rumkowski emerged from the Sperre, a broken man. His hair had turned white, his hands shook when he spoke. In meetings, he stared at nothing, repeating the same phrase, "I did what I had to do." His assistants avoided his eyes. Even those who had once defended him now whispered that he had crossed a line from compromise to collaboration. Yet others pitied him. He carried the burden alone, one survivor said later. He made himself the villain because he thought it would save us. But the ghetto no longer wanted heroes. It wanted the dead back. Hans Bibo, meanwhile, returned to his office satisfied. The ghetto had been purified, as his report called it. He wrote that the remaining population was fit for labor and entirely disciplined. He noted with bureaucratic pride that the operation had been completed without serious disruption. His numbers were perfect. His conscience was clean. To him, it was another successful quarter. After the Sperre, the ghetto changed forever. The absence of children altered everything. The laughter that once echoed between buildings was gone. The small hands that once helped in the workshops were missing. Even the hunger felt different, quieter, emptier. People worked mechanically, their eyes vacant. The ghetto had become a city of adults, haunted by the ghosts of its own youth. Cultural life, what little remained, turned inward. Painters drew portraits of lost faces from memory. Writers wrote poems they never dared read aloud. The surviving teachers gathered in secret to remember their students, reciting their names as if to keep them alive through sound. The ghetto still functioned on the surface. Workshops reopened, rations were distributed, but something irreversible had happened. The heart of the ghetto had been torn out. The Germans, satisfied with their work, loosened restrictions for a while. Production resumed. Rumkowski, desperate to restore a sense of purpose, announced new labor initiatives. He promised better conditions, higher output, maybe even better rations. People listened, but no one believed. His words, once commanding, now fell flat. He still wore his neatly pressed uniform, still signed papers, still spoke of our collective future. But the future had died that September. The Jewish police, once feared, were now despised. Many resigned or took their own lives. Those who remained tried to justify themselves. We were saving others, they said. But the ghetto didn't forgive. Every street corner, every empty house reminded them of what they had helped destroy. As autumn deepened, the weather turned colder, and with it came the knowledge that the worst was not over. The Sperre had been only one step in a plan that stretched far beyond Lodz. The Germans were no longer improvising their cruelty. They were perfecting it. The efficiency of the September deportations became a model for other ghettos across occupied Poland. What had happened here was not an exception. It was the template. And yet, those who survived still worked, still woke each morning to the sound of the factory whistle. They went to their benches, their sewing machines, their forges. They bent over their tasks with silent determination. They no longer believed that labor would save them, but they worked anyway, because work was the only thing that kept the mind from collapsing under the weight of loss. In the evenings, people gathered in whispers to share stories of the missing. They recited names like prayers, lighting candles in hidden corners. The flames flickered against cracked walls, illuminating faces that no longer looked human, faces of people who had seen the edge of the world and still lived on it. The Sperre ended officially on September 12th, but shadow never lifted. The ghetto that remained was smaller, quieter, and infinitely sadder. The workshops resumed their rhythm, but now every needle stitch carried the memory of a child's scream. Every hammer blow was an echo of the boots that had marched through those streets. The people who remained had survived, but survival no longer felt like victory. It felt like guilt. When winter came, the snow covered the ghetto in white silence. For a brief moment, it looked peaceful again, almost beautiful. But beneath that snow lay the traces of the unthinkable, the footprints of soldiers, the blood of children, the ashes of innocence. The fences stood unchanged, but inside them, the world had ended. The Great Deportation of September 1942 had done what starvation and disease could not. It had stripped the ghetto not only of life, but of its spirit. Those who remained no longer asked when the war would end or whether they would be freed. They asked only how long they could endure. The machines still hummed, the factories still glowed, but their sound had changed. It was no longer the rhythm of survival. It was the slow, steady heartbeat of a city mourning itself. Chapter 9. Industry Without Illusion, late 1942 to 1943. The smoke of the September deportations had barely cleared when the ghetto began to breathe again, but it was a different kind of breathing now, slower, quieter, mechanical. The air felt hollow. The laughter of children was gone, the songs silenced. Every sound echoed differently through the narrow streets, as if the city itself knew it was living on borrowed time. The factories reopened, the workshops hummed once more, but no one believed in Rumkowski's promises anymore. Labor was no longer salvation, it was postponement. Each stitch, each nail, each movement of the machines was simply a prayer whispered against the inevitable. The ghetto of late 1942 was a place that existed somewhere between life and death. The people inside had survived the Sperre, but were haunted by it. Their faces were thinner, their eyes darker, and their steps slower. They had seen what obedience cost. They had heard the trains leave for Chelmno and not return. And yet, they still went to work each morning. What else could they do? In a world where resistance meant annihilation, survival had become a kind of defiance in itself. Rumkowski returned to his post as if nothing had happened, though he looked 20 years older. His voice, once booming and proud, had become low and tired, and even when he spoke of hope, it sounded like he was pleading with himself to believe it. "We must continue our work," he said. "The Germans have seen our worth. They will not destroy a place that serves their needs." The people listened, but their faces were blank. The elder of the Jews had become the symbol of a broken logic, the man who kept the engines running in a factory built over graves. The Germans, satisfied with their cleansing of the ghetto, turned their attention back to production. Hans Bibo's reports to Berlin boasted that the workforce was now efficient and disciplined. He wrote that the unproductive elements had been removed, and he wasn't lying. With the children, elderly, and sick gone, the ghetto had become a machine stripped of sentiment. It produced goods for the Reich with brutal precision, Uniforms, leather boots, brushes, gloves, furniture, and even toys for German children. The irony of that last product was not lost on anyone. Men who had lost their own children now carved wooden dolls for others. Women who had seen their babies taken away now sewed dresses for the daughters of their captors. The workshops grew larger. Entire blocks were converted into factories. The air was thick with dust and sweat. The constant whir of machines became the soundtrack of existence. People worked from dawn until long after dark, collapsing on their cots with hands blistered and eyes burning. The faint glow of oil lamps illuminated faces hollowed by hunger. Yet amidst the exhaustion, there was rhythm, a kind of grim order that gave people something to hold on to. The ghetto had become, as one survivor later said, a world built on the ruins of hope. Food remained scarce. The official ration still barely kept people alive. Rumkowski's administration distributed watery soup and coarse bread, but hunger gnawed at every corner of the ghetto. Workers sometimes received small bonuses of food for high output, a few extra potatoes, a lump of sugar. Those scraps became the difference between life and death. Smuggling, once common, was now almost impossible. The fences were too high, the guards too ruthless, and the punishment too certain. Yet still, people found ways. Hidden holes beneath sheds, secret exchanges with Polish workers who risked their own lives to trade. Hunger, more than anything, united the ghetto in a quiet, endless war against the Germans' indifference. The winter of 1942 was brutal. The cold seeped into every wall, every blanket, every bone. People burned whatever they could find, furniture, books, scraps of wood, to stay warm. Smoke filled the air, black and heavy. Many didn't survive those months. Typhus returned, spreading through the overcrowded buildings like wildfire. Doctors worked without medicine, using what they could: boiled water, rags, prayers. The morgues overflowed. The burial teams worked day and night, pulling frozen bodies from apartments. In some homes, families refused to give up their dead, sitting beside them for days as if pretending they were only sleeping. And yet, even through that darkness, the human instinct to endure did not vanish. People continued to marry, to write, to dream. Underground teachers reopened secret schools for the remaining children, those who had been hidden during the Sperre. Lessons were whispered in cellars. Paper was precious, pencils even more so. Some artists continued to paint, sketching scenes of ghetto life on scraps of cloth or cardboard. The colors were muted, but the emotion behind them was vivid. Eyes staring through fences, hands clutching bread, shadows stretching across empty streets. Rumkowski, in his own way, tried to rebuild order. He reorganized the ghetto's labor system, dividing into sections: textiles, metals, wood, and leather. He created a new slogan: work and discipline. Posters appeared on the walls again, urging productivity, promising that the industrious will live. No one believed it, but everyone obeyed. The ghetto had learned that disbelief did not cancel obedience. People worked not out of faith in Rumkowski, but because work was the only thing that stood between them and deportation. The Germans rewarded this obedience with a cruel kind of stability. Unlike Warsaw or Krakow, the Lodz Ghetto remained intact through 1943. There were no mass liquidations, no uprisings, no fires. To the outside world, it appeared calm. The Nazis pointed to it as proof of their benevolent administration. They called it the model ghetto. Bibo hosted visiting officials who toured the factories, nodding with approval as they watched workers in rags producing goods for the Reich. They left with photographs of order, not realizing that beneath that order lay the quietest horror of all, a society that had accepted death as part of its routine. Rumkowski's power became absolute again, though it no longer carried the same authority. He ruled through habit rather than loyalty. He still gave speeches, still wore his tailored coat, still signed every document with his flowing blue signature. But the people no longer looked at him with hope or hatred. They looked at him the way one looks at a storm, something beyond control, something that simply existed. In the evenings, he walked through the streets surrounded by guards, his figure framed by the flickering light of oil lamps. Survivors recalled that he looked like a man haunted by ghosts. Perhaps he was. His relationship with Hans Bibo became even more transactional. The two men met regularly, discussing quotas, production levels, and rations. Bibo continued to treat the ghetto as his personal enterprise, squeezing every last ounce of profit from it. He praised Rumkowski for his efficiency, calling him a capable administrator. To Rumkowski, those words were both poison and protection. He needed Bibo's approval to keep the ghetto alive, but every compliment reminded him that he was serving the architect of his people's misery. Their meetings were a theater of survival. One man pretending to be in control, the other pretending to care. Inside the factories, a strange sense of pride began to grow again. Workers took comfort in their skills. Shoemakers bragged about the quality of their boots. Seamstresses competed over who could finish a uniform fastest. They didn't see this as service to the enemy. They saw it as proof that they were still human, still capable of creating something. For a few hours each day, the rhythm of the machines drowned out the memories of crying and gunshots. That rhythm became their heartbeat. At night, when the factories fell silent, the ghetto became eerily quiet. The only sounds were the creaking of wood, the wind against the fences, and the occasional cry of someone mourning. The streets were too empty, the sky too dark. Many couldn't sleep, haunted by dreams of despair, by the faces of children they would never see again. In some houses, people held makeshift memorials, lighting tiny candles made from oil and thread. The flames flickered weakly, as if struggling to stay alive in the same way they did. By spring 1943, word began to spread of uprisings in other ghettos, in Warsaw, in Białystok. Stories filtered in through smugglers and underground couriers. People whispered of resistance, of Jews taking up arms, of fighting back against the Germans. For a brief moment, a spark of possibility lit the darkness. But in Lodz, resistance was a dream that couldn't take root. The ghetto was too isolated, too starved, too exhausted. Rumkowski forbade any talk of rebellion. "It will destroy us," he said. And most people agreed. They had seen what happened when the Germans decided to destroy. So the Lodz ghetto remained quiet while others burned. Its silence was both its curse and its shield. The Nazis, impressed by its order, allowed it to exist. They needed its factories, its output, its illusion of cooperation. But to the people inside, that silence was suffocating. They lived in a suspended world, where death could arrive at any moment but often didn't. Some called it the waiting room of hell. The months passed in a blur of work and hunger. Each day was indistinguishable from the one before. People stopped counting time by dates and started measuring it in deliveries, in how many uniforms they finished, how many shipments left the station. The Germans measured the same, but for different reasons. In their ledgers, the ghetto was a line item of profit, a column of efficiency. The suffering beneath it was invisible. And then, in late 1943, the ghetto's isolation deepened further. The Germans began liquidating other ghettos across Poland. Trains full of deportees passed through Lodz, but none stopped. People saw them from a distance, the faces pressed against barred windows, the hands reaching out. It was a glimpse of the future, though few recognized it as such. Rumkowski tried to reassure his people once more. "Lodz will remain," he said. "We are indispensable." But the word indispensable had lost all meaning. That winter, the workshops worked harder than ever. The Wehrmacht demanded more goods as the war on the Eastern Front turned against Germany. Bibo demanded higher quotas, and Rumkowski complied. The workers obeyed. They had learned long ago that obedience was the only currency left. But behind the monotony, something had shifted. The illusions that once kept them going were gone. They no longer believed that work would save them. They no longer believed in Rumkowski, in the Germans, in the world outside the fence. They worked because movement was better than stillness, because as long as their hands were busy, their minds could not drift to Chelmno or the empty rooms where their children had slept. The ghetto had become a factory of ghosts. Every corner, every street, every wall carried memories of those who were gone. People avoided looking too long at each other, because every face was a reminder of someone missing. And yet, they continued, walking to work, standing in line for soup, pretending that life still had a rhythm. The miracle was not that they survived. The miracle was that they managed to keep living at all. By the end of 1943, the ghetto was still functioning. It was the last major ghetto left in occupied Poland. The Germans called it success. Rumkowski called it endurance. But to the people inside, it was simply existence stripped of everything except breath. The factories glowed through the night, their windows reflecting a faint, ghostly light. Outside, the snow began to fall, covering the fences, the graves, and the silence. The Lodz ghetto had survived another year, but survival no longer meant safety. It only meant waiting for the next command, the next list, the next train. The illusion was gone now. There was no mercy in labor, no protection in obedience. Only the endless, grinding machinery of survival, cold, repetitive, inescapable. The ghetto lived, but it no longer believed in life. The year closed with the same question that had haunted them since the beginning. How long could they endure? No one knew the answer. They only knew that the machines would start again tomorrow, the fences would still stand, and the world outside would still be silent. The industry of survival had become an industry without illusion. And in that emptiness, the people of Lodz waited for history to remember them, even as it prepared to forget. Chapter 10. The Illusion of Stability, 1943 to 1944. The year 1943 bled into 1944 without ceremony, without change, without hope. In the Lodz ghetto, time no longer moved forward. It circled endlessly, like the wheels of the sewing machines that hummed day and night. The fences had become part of the landscape, the guards part of the air, the hunger part of the body. Those who had survived the deportations to Chelmno now lived in a strange twilight between despair and discipline. To the Germans, the ghetto appeared calm, productive, obedient, even profitable. But that calm was a mask, stretched over a population that had learned to hide its fear behind the mechanical rhythm of labor. The city beyond the fence no longer felt real. The sounds of trams and markets were faint, distorted by distance and wire. Inside the ghetto, everything revolved around the workshops. They were the arteries of survival, pulsing with the thin lifeblood of work. Every dawn began with the factory whistle, its echo cutting through the silence. People woke without words, their movements automatic. They walked through the narrow, mud-slick streets with the slow, measured gait of those who had forgotten what haste was for. There was no reason to hurry. The days were all the same. Rumkowski, still presiding as the elder of the Jews, had regained his administrative strength, but lost whatever humanity once lingered in his face. His speeches, once full of fire, now carried a weary authority, the voice of a man who knew that the illusion he was selling was crumbling. He still stood before the workers, telling them that the ghetto was safe, that its industries were essential to the German war effort, that their lives had meaning because they served a purpose. The people nodded, but no one believed. The only reason they listened was because belief, even false belief, made the hunger easier to bear. The ghetto had become an island of forced normalcy in a sea of extermination. By mid-1943, the ghettos of Warsaw, Krakow, and Białystok were gone, erased by deportations and uprisings. In those places, people had chosen death over obedience. Lodz was different. It was quiet, efficient, contained. The Germans called it a model ghetto, an example of how Jews could be controlled through structure rather than violence. That reputation was the only thing keeping it alive. Rumkowski and Hans Bibo both understood that. They built the illusion of stability like craftsmen assembling a fragile clock, knowing that any crack, any resistance, would shatter everything. Bibo continued to treat the ghetto as a business. He wore polished boots and a fur-lined coat, arriving each week to inspect the factories. He spoke with the tone of a factory owner, not a conqueror. He praised Rumkowski's administration for its efficiency, congratulated foremen on increased output, and reminded everyone that work guarantees existence. He smiled when he said it, as though it were a kindness rather than a threat. His reports to Berlin spoke of the ghetto as a success story. He wrote that the Jewish workforce remains disciplined and productive, and that the Litzmannstadt ghetto continues to serve as an economic asset to the Reich. But even in his ledgers, the numbers told a different story: a slow decline, a system running out of strength. Inside the workshops, the workers were shadows of their former selves. Their faces were gaunt, their hands skeletal. They sewed, hammered, glued, and carved until their bodies trembled with exhaustion. The sound of machinery filled the air, blending with the coughs of the sick and the clatter of tools. The factories were lit by dim bulbs that flickered like dying stars. Sometimes a worker would collapse, sliding silently to the floor. Others would drag the body away and continue working. The rhythm never stopped. In a world where rest could mean death, movement became instinct. The food rations had shrunk again. Bread was rationed by the gram, potatoes by the piece. Soup was mostly water, flavored faintly with cabbage or beet. People chewed slowly, trying to make each bite last longer. They spoke less, saved their energy. Conversations were reduced to essentials: work, illness, rations, rumors. Even laughter had become dangerous. It reminded people of what they had lost. Rumkowski's administration maintained its bureaucracy with almost religious devotion. Every name was recorded, every death documented, every loaf of bread accounted for. The ghetto's Office of Statistics produced charts and graphs showing production levels, population changes, and mortality rates. These papers were sent to Bibo's office, where they were filed neatly alongside invoices and shipping manifests. The machinery of murder was hidden beneath layers of documentation. Paper became the final language of the Holocaust: precise, emotionless, efficient. By the spring of 1943, the ghetto's population had stabilized around 70,000. For the first time in years, there were no deportations. No trains left Raid gas station. That absence became a form of relief, though no one said it aloud. The people called it the quiet time. Children, the few that remained, hidden during the Sperre, played in alleys again. Musicians began to perform quietly in workshops during breaks. Painters used soot and scraps to make art on the walls. For a moment, life seemed to flicker back, fragile but defiant. Rumkowski seized this opportunity to strengthen his illusion of order. He declared that the ghetto had entered a new phase, a time of productivity and calm. He opened new workshops, reorganized departments, and even launched cultural initiatives. There were concerts, theater performances, and poetry readings. They were small, secret, and heavily monitored, but they existed. The Germans allowed them because it made the ghetto easier to manage. Hope, after all, was cheaper than food. But beneath this veneer of stability, despair had simply learned to disguise itself. People smiled less because they no longer needed to pretend. They had accepted their place in the machinery of survival. They did not dream of freedom. They dreamed of a loaf of bread, a day without pain, a night without fear. The human imagination, once the ghetto's last refuge, had narrowed to a single wish: endurance. Outside the fences, the war was turning against Germany. The Red Army had begun its counteroffensive, pushing westward through the ruins of Stalingrad and Kursk. The front lines crept closer to Poland with each passing month. Rumors reached the ghetto, whispered reports from Polish workers, snippets of BBC broadcasts heard through smuggled radios. The Germans were retreating. Some dared to hope that liberation might come soon. But hope in the ghetto was a dangerous thing. It could lift you for a moment, then crush you when the reality returned. The fences were still there. The guards were still there. Liberation was a word without a date. Bibo and his superiors were growing nervous. Berlin was demanding more output with fewer resources. The Reich's armies needed uniforms, boots, weapons, and supplies, and the factories of Lodz had to deliver. The ghetto became a cog in the collapsing German war machine, one that could not afford to fail. Bibo ordered longer work hours, stricter quotas, and harsher punishments for inefficiency. Rumkowski obeyed, hoping to preserve the illusion that productivity could still buy safety. He issued decrees urging everyone to work with renewed energy for the sake of our survival. But the people had no energy left to give. They were working on hunger, on muscle memory, on the faint echo of instinct. The illusion of safety began to crack in the summer of 1943. German soldiers increased patrols, and new rumors spread, whispers of final liquidation. People had heard the phrase before, in other ghettos, and they knew what it meant. Rumkowski dismissed the rumors, insisting that Lodz was different. "We are essential," he said again. But his voice trembled now. He had said the same words before Chelmno, before the Sperre, before the children were taken. The ghetto remembered. To distract from the growing fear, the administration staged another concert, featuring songs written by ghetto musicians. The lyrics were filled with sorrow disguised as irony. One song spoke of work as joy, another of bread as love. The audience listened in silence, tears streaking their faces, and when the last note ended, there was no applause. They understood that art could not save them any more than obedience could, but it gave them something precious, a moment to feel human again. As winter approached once more, the Germans began making lists again. Names, addresses, ages. Officially, these were labor reorganizations. Unofficially, everyone knew what they meant. The lists were death sentences written in bureaucratic language. Rumkowski's office worked late into the night, sorting papers, trying to delay the inevitable. He sent delegation after delegation to plead with Bibo, insisting that the ghetto still had value. "We can increase production by 20%, he promised. "We can make anything you require." Bibo listened, nodded, smiled his thin smile, and sent the reports to Berlin. In January 1944, the ghetto marked its 4th year under German rule. There was no celebration. Rumkowski issued a brief statement calling the anniversary a triumph of endurance. But the word triumph felt obscene. The factories were still running, the people still alive, yet everyone sensed that they were ghosts maintaining a city of shadows. The illusion of stability was reaching its end. Outside, the Red Army was less than 300 kilometers away. Inside, the Germans were preparing to erase their experiment. The order would come in the summer, but its shadow was already there, in the empty eyes of the guards, in the quiet urgency of the German administrators packing files into crates. The ghetto still worked. The machine still turned. The people still followed Rumkowski's orders. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The illusion that labor could buy safety had finally died. The people no longer worked to live. They worked to forget that they were already dead. In February, Hans Bibo inspected the ghetto for what would be one of the last times. He stood in a factory doorway, watching the workers bent over their sewing machines. He smiled, satisfied with the order he saw, but something about it unnerved even him. The silence was too complete, too perfect. It was the silence of resignation. He wrote in his final report that the Jewish labor force remains productive, though morale appears low. It was the understatement of the century. By the spring of 1944, the illusion could no longer hold. The ghetto's stores were empty, its workers skeletal. Even the Germans began scavenging for supplies. The war was collapsing around them, but they clung to the ritual of control. Rumkowski continued to issue decrees, though fewer people came to hear them. The posters faded in the rain. The fences, once symbols of confinement, now seemed like the only things still standing. The Lodz Ghetto, once the second largest in occupied Europe, had become a graveyard disguised as a factory. Its people moved like machines, its leaders like ghosts. And yet, it endured. Even as the rest of occupied Poland burned, even as the trains to Auschwitz carried the last remnants of Jewish life from Warsaw and Krakow, the ghetto still stood. It was an island of stillness in a world of fire, the final illusion of stability before the darkness returned. No one inside knew it, but they were living through the final calm before the end. The machines hummed, the lights glowed, and the city worked through its last nights, unaware that the orders for liquidation had already been signed. The illusion that had sustained them, that obedience could preserve life, that work could protect them, was about to shatter forever. The Lodz Ghetto had outlasted every other, not because it was safe, but because it was useful. And usefulness, in the logic of the Nazi world, was the most fragile illusion of all. The calm that had carried them through the years was ending. The fences that had defined their lives were about to open, not to freedom, but to the waiting trains bound for Auschwitz. The illusion of stability had done its work. Now it would die with them. Chapter 11. Rumkowski's Last Gamble. Children and the September Deportation of 1942. The Lodz Ghetto had endured years of hunger, disease, and death, but nothing had prepared its inhabitants for the events that unfolded in September 1942. The city within fences had learned to survive under impossible conditions, working, eating, hiding, praying, enduring. Yet survival is fragile, a precarious balance that depends on order and illusion. And when the Nazis decided that the next step in their systematic extermination would be the removal of the most vulnerable, the children, the elderly, the sick, the illusion collapsed like a brittle wall under the weight of reality. It began with the announcement of the Sperre, the blockade. German loudspeakers echoed through the streets in harsh, clipped commands. Every inhabitant of the ghetto was ordered to remain in their homes. The factories and workshops, which had become the ghetto's lifeblood, fell silent. For hours, people listened to the thrum of the wind, the occasional bark of a German officer's command, the muffled cries of those already taken in previous deportations. The city seemed to hold its breath. Doors were locked, windows shuttered. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers stood silent in hallways. Siblings huddled together, whispering prayers and promises they knew they could not keep. Rumkowski, the elder of the Jews, understood immediately what this meant. Weeks of warning had reached him through the German administration. Orders from Berlin had demanded the removal of the so-called non-essential population, the children who could not work, the sick who could not contribute, the elderly whose labor had expired. In his office, he convened his aides, eyes sunken with fatigue, hands trembling over paperwork. He wrote lists, tallied ages, tried to calculate how to minimize the loss while obeying the Germans' cruel demands. The moral calculus was impossible. To save the many, he would have to sacrifice the few. To save himself, he would have to appear compliant. On the morning of the operation, the streets of the ghetto were eerily silent. The familiar drone of sewing machines, the hammering of wooden crates, the scraping of metal in the workshops, all had ceased. German trucks and SS men rolled through the streets, accompanied by the Jewish police who had once been instruments of order but were now instruments of fear. The loudspeakers barked instructions. Everyone must remain indoors. Mothers whispered hurriedly to their children, hiding them under beds, behind cupboards, under floorboards. Some had sewn children into sacks, hoping to make them invisible, hoping that human ingenuity could outwit industrialized death. Rumkowski himself appeared before the assembled crowd in Marieson Square, his pale face a mask of determination and despair. His voice, once a source of authority, trembled as he spoke. A grievous blow has come upon us. The Germans demand that we surrender the youngest among us, our children. I am charged with carrying out this order. I beg you, give me your children. Do not resist. If we refuse, all of us will perish. His hands shook visibly as he gestured toward the square, toward the trucks waiting on the streets. Thousands of faces stared at him, frozen, hearing words they could not comprehend, words that twisted hope into horror. Mothers screamed, fathers shouted, some simply fell silent, their eyes blank. The moment became a crucible of fear and obedience, a prelude to the unimaginable. The process began systematically. Trucks rolled to the streets, stopping in front of apartment buildings. Soldiers and police entered, separating the children, the elderly, and the sick from their families. Fathers tried to protect sons. Mothers clutched daughters to their chests. Siblings clung to each other with a desperation that made the air tremble. Some attempted to escape through hidden passages, crawl through attics, slip under doors. Others were caught immediately, dragged into the waiting vehicles by soldiers who had been trained for precision and cruelty. The air was filled with the sounds of weeping, shouting, and the metallic clang of doors being closed on small lives. Inside the trucks, the children were crammed together, pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. The elderly leaned on each other for support, some muttering prayers, others silent, eyes wide in disbelief. No one knew the destination. Rumors had spread, whispered by those who had survived previous deportations. Chelmno. The word was dangerous to utter aloud, but it carried a dreadful certainty. The children did not understand. Some clung to siblings, some cried out for parents, some stared blankly at the walls of the vehicle, as if the mere act of looking could transport them back to safety. Rumkowski's decision to comply with the Germans was a gamble of survival. He believed that by offering the children willingly, by obeying in a controlled fashion, he could protect the remainder of the ghetto, the adults who still labored in the workshops. He arranged lists meticulously, categorized families, tried to delay some transports while prioritizing others. Each signature he placed on a deportation list was a heartbeat extinguished, a life betrayed. He rationalized it as necessary, a measure to ensure that the working corps remained intact. Yet history would later judge this act with horror, seeing the fine line he had crossed between protector and collaborator. The trucks departed for Reich gas station, their engines growling over frozen tracks. From there, the victims were loaded onto trains, packed tightly into cattle cars, with barely space to breathe. Rumkowski's staff, those loyal to his administration, accompanied the transports, maintaining order, giving instructions, sometimes holding children's hands as if that could shield them from fate. Guards kept watch, ensuring compliance, and occasionally shouting over the cries to enforce silence. Parents watched helplessly as the doors slammed, as the trains began to move, their screams merging with the rattle of wheels and the low thrum of engines. Upon arrival at Chelmno, the truth of the German plan revealed itself in its most horrifying form. The children, the elderly, the sick were not being relocated to work or resettlement. They were taken directly to the gas vans sealed inside, the engines turned on, and the exhaust fumes filling the compartment until every last breath was extinguished. Bodies were removed and buried in mass graves, their possessions stripped and catalogued, the few belongings often sent back to Germany to be reused or sold. The operation was mechanical, systematic, efficient. Life became inventory. Death became profit. Back in the ghetto, the absence of the children was a wound that could not be dressed. Empty rooms, silent classrooms, abandoned toys, each a reminder of the lives stolen. People walked past these spaces with a numbness that only grew with time. Rumkowski continued to give orders, urging adults to return to their work, to maintain production, to prove their utility to the Germans. But the rhythm of labor had changed. The workshops were quieter, the laughter absent. Each hammer stroke, each sewing machines was haunted by the memory of the missing. Survival had become a ritual of ghosts. The psychological impact was immense. Families mourned openly and secretly. Teachers who had hidden children now taught empty classrooms, writing lessons on blackboards to invisible pupils. Mothers wandered streets in silence, calling names that would never be answered. The air was thick with grief, yet the people obeyed, for to stop working was to invite the same fate. The very act of labor had become a defense, a fragile shield against annihilation. Rumkowski's reputation shifted irrevocably. Among his supporters, he was still seen as the man who had kept the ghetto functioning, the administrator who had delayed the complete destruction. Among others, he was now viewed with suspicion and hatred. His decision to give the children over to the Germans was both a desperate act of control and a moral fracture that would stain his legacy forever. Yet in his mind, Every decision, every signature, every order was made to save lives. An impossible calculation where there were never enough to protect all. The months following the September deportation were filled with attempts to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Workshops expanded, new orders arrived from Bibo and Berlin, and the machinery of production once again filled the streets with sound. Yet no child laughed, no classroom echoed, no playground rang with innocence. Survival became mechanical, a matter of showing up, keeping pace, continuing work, and hoping the Germans would deem one useful enough to remain. The rhythm of the ghetto had changed from endurance to ritualized defiance in the face of annihilation. Even the underground culture, fragile though it had been, could not fully recover. Secret schools resumed, but only for those older children who had been spared. Musicians played quietly during breaks, their instruments muted as if sound itself might betray them. Artists sketched empty streets, walls, and courtyards, memorializing absence more than presence. Every act of creativity became both rebellion and memorial, a record of what had been lost and what persisted in memory alone. As winter approached, the ghetto faced its harshest months. Food remained scarce, rationed to the barest minimum. Typhus and other diseases spread with deadly efficiency. Rumkowski's administration tried to maintain order, but even his ability to influence events was waning. Every day brought reminders that obedience could no longer guarantee life. The children were gone, the elderly diminished, and the sick could not be saved. The machinery of survival creaked under its own weight. Yet, even in this darkness, the people of Lodz continued to work. Factories operated, textiles were produced, leather goods shipped, wooden crates packed. Each act of labor became a small assertion of existence against the encroaching shadow of death. Those who survived did, so not because of hope or faith, but because they moved, because they bent to the rhythm of machines, because they obeyed in order to remain alive. Survival had become an industrial process, indistinguishable from the production they carried out each day. The September deportation left scars that could never heal. Empty streets, hollowed homes, silent schools. The ghetto was a landscape of absence. Yet within it, a fragile semblance of life continued, maintained by Rumkowski's administration, by Bibo's oversight, and by the indomitable will of those who still moved through the streets. They were witnesses to atrocity, participants in survival, prisoners of circumstance. And while the illusion of order persisted, everyone knew it was a fragile, temporary shell. By the end of 1942, the ghetto had been transformed. Children were gone, elderly diminished, and the sick removed. The workshops hummed with labor. The Jewish administration labored over new orders and ration distributions, and the German overseers recorded every ounce of output. The Lodz ghetto remained, but it was a different place than it had been even a year before. It was quieter, emptier, and infinitely more haunted. The people inside survived, but they were now living monuments to the lives that had been stolen, reminders that obedience could prolong life, but could not prevent the cruelty that had already been set in motion. And yet, despite everything, they worked. They worked because it was all that remained. They worked because stillness meant death. They worked because memory alone could not sustain them. The children, the sick, the elderly, all gone, had left behind a lesson imprinted on every street, every workshop, every heartbeat. Survival was not mercy. It was endurance, and endurance demanded both body and soul. The ghetto continued its rhythm into the cold months, unaware that the machinery of extermination was far from finished. Rumkowski's gamble had delayed destruction, but the Nazis' appetite for annihilation had only grown. Those who survived the September deportation would soon discover that no calculation, no list, no obedience could ultimately shield them from the next wave of terror. The illusion of control, carefully maintained for years, had begun to unravel, and the end, though distant, was inexorably approaching. Chapter 12, Labor and Deception. The Mechanics of Survival, 1943 to 1944. By the early months of 1943, the Lodz Ghetto had settled into a grim routine, a rhythm dictated by necessity and fear. The fences, once shocking, had become invisible lines in the minds of those who lived inside them. The barbed wire etched the boundaries of existence, defining where life could persist and where it could not. The people of the ghetto had adapted to its suffocating order. They had learned that survival was measured not in hope or freedom, but in the hours worked, the machines operated, the textiles produced, the shoes repaired, the crates packed. Labor had become the language of life, but it was a language of deception as well. The Germans called it efficiency. Hans Bibo called it productivity. Rumkowski called it salvation. And for the people of Lodz, it was survival, tenuous, exhausting, and morally complicated. The workshops were the arteries of the ghetto, pulsing with the sound of sewing machines, hammers, saws, and looms. Every building, every basement, every corner that could hold a desk, a stool, a workbench had been converted into a factory. Women and men labored from dawn to dusk. Children too young to be formally employed scavenged, swept, and polished, all in service of an invisible machine that promised nothing in return. The scale of organization was staggering. Rumkowski, still presiding as the elder of the Jews, maintained meticulous records of every worker, every output, every ration distributed. Labor was divided into categories: textiles, metalwork, woodcraft, leather goods. Each worker was tracked, measured, and evaluated. Absenteeism was punished. Mistakes were met with reprimands. Efficiency, even in a ghetto where life itself was precarious, became a moral imperative. The workbench replaced the home. The factory whistle replaced the church bell. Every stitch was both a plea for survival and a submission to the logic of the occupiers. Bibo's visits became more frequent as the war progressed. He wore polished boots and immaculate uniforms, his eyes scanning the workshops with a predatory calm. He spoke to the foreman in clipped, businesslike tones, praising output, noting inefficiencies, suggesting changes to processes. He visited schools and orphanages, inspecting the remaining children, evaluating their potential usefulness. Every action was calculated. He treated human beings as raw materials, as cogs in a vast machine of production. Nothing about his demeanor suggested cruelty, yet cruelty was built into every decision he made. Rumkowski, for his part, tried to maintain control while appeasing the Germans. He believed that demonstrating the ghetto's value through labor could buy time, could delay destruction. He expanded workshops, increased quotas, and introduced new departments: a ghetto postal service, a fire brigade, additional textile units. He created a small currency system to manage internal trade and compensate for rations. Every step was an attempt to prove that life in Lodz was indispensable. Yet every move was a double-edged sword. The more efficient the ghetto became, the more the Germans relied on it, and the more they demanded. The promise of survival was inseparable from the machinery of oppression. Even amid the oppressive routine, human ingenuity persisted. Workers shared scraps of food, hiding small portions under their clothing, trading them in secret. Children scavenged from refuse, creating miniature games to distract themselves from hunger. Teachers continued to hold clandestine classes, scribbling lessons on scraps of paper, whispering words of math, language, and history. Artists sketched the streets, the fences, the faces of the dead, preserving memory in charcoal and ink. These acts were small rebellions against erasure, fragile sparks of life in a world that had normalized death. Yet disease, starvation, and exhaustion remained constant companions. Typhus returned, carried by lice and facilitated by overcrowding. The hospitals were overwhelmed, treating the sick with little more than boiling water, rags, and prayer. Bodies were removed from homes, counted, and buried in cemeteries that were overfilled and freezing. Death was now a constant rhythm, measured alongside the ticking of clocks and the hum of machines. Each day's survival was provisional, dependent on the fragile balance of rations, labor, and luck. Rumkowski's speeches grew longer, more elaborate, more desperate. He addressed the ghetto in the evenings, urging order, urging obedience, urging production. He compared the workshops to arteries carrying life, labor to oxygen, output to salvation. His words were a mixture of conviction and self-preservation, delivered in a tone that was part sermon, part plea. The people listened out of habit, fear, and necessity. Belief had long since been replaced by the mechanics of compliance. Work was all that remained tangible, and in its repetition lay the illusion of control. Bibo's oversight intensified. He implemented stricter monitoring, introduced performance reports, and reorganized departments for maximum output. The ghetto's workshops were inspected weekly, their output meticulously recorded. Any slowdown was investigated, any deviation punished. Efficiency became a metric for survival. Rumkowski negotiated, pleaded, and complied in equal measure, always trying to extend the ghetto's lifespan. Yet every concession he made reinforced the system of exploitation, binding survival to the machinery of obedience. Food remained insufficient. Rations were calculated with precision, enough to keep workers alive and productive, but never enough to restore strength. The adults consumed each bite carefully, often sharing portions with children hidden in basements or attics. Hunger gnawed constantly, dulling limbs, clouding thought, but it also enforced discipline. Those who felt too weak to work were removed from production lists and quietly transported away to the rear of the ghetto, where fate awaited. Hunger was both punishment and regulator, a constant reminder of the stakes. The children who had survived the Sperre and previous deportations were now concentrated in orphanages and hidden classrooms. They played quietly, whispering, hiding scraps of bread, and helping in workshops when possible. Their laughter was muted, measured, aware that joy could attract the wrong attention. Even in games, they mimicked work, carrying bundles, stacking objects, rehearsing the rhythm of labor that would define their existence. Innocence had been redefined to survive in a city where survival depended on utility. Rumkowski's administration attempted to manage morale. Cultural programs were introduced, concerts, poetry readings, small theatrical performances. These events were carefully monitored, staged within approved spaces, and intended to reinforce obedience. The performances were both acts of resistance and acts of survival. They reminded the people of their humanity, even as they were reminded daily of their vulnerability. Art became a fragile shield, memory became a weapon, and ritualized labor became both prayer and penance. Disease, however, could not be managed with speeches or culture. Typhus spread rapidly through crowded quarters. The infirm were quarantined, often without adequate care, and sometimes left to die alone. Rumkowski's administration documented each case meticulously, tracking symptoms, assigning caregivers, and rationing treatment. The records were precise, detailed, bureaucratic, but they could not alter the outcome. Death remained omnipresent, a silent partner in every workshop, every classroom, every corner of the ghetto. By mid-1943, the ghetto's population had stabilized around 60,000. It was no longer the vibrant, bustling city it had been. The fences enclosed a skeletal version of life, stripped of children, elderly, and sick. The streets were quieter, the workshops more efficient, and yet the human spirit within them was fragile. Every action, every movement, was dictated by necessity. Labor was survival. Survival was labor. Life had become a mechanism, mechanical, repetitive, and inescapable. The Germans continued to visit regularly. Bibo inspected the workshops, noting efficiency, comparing output to quotas, measuring the value of human labor in Reichsmarks. He praised Rumkowski publicly, calling him a model administrator. He overlooked the suffering behind the numbers, because numbers were all that mattered. Human faces, hollow and haunted, were invisible in the ledger. Each day's production validated the ghetto's continued existence, but it also reminded everyone that usefulness was both their shield and their trap. Rumkowski, aware of the delicate balance he maintained, continued his efforts to demonstrate value. He introduced new departments, reorganized existing workshops, and increased quotas in hopes of appeasing the Germans. He implemented strict oversight, demanding attendance, performance, and obedience. The workers complied, knowing that any lapse, however small, could be fatal. Yet even in compliance, there was resentment. Every instruction, every signature on a list, was a reminder of what had been lost: children, families, community. Obedience had become both necessity and burden. Despite the unrelenting machinery of survival, human resilience persisted. Workers shared small acts of kindness, a piece of bread here, a comforting word there. Teachers continued to educate secretly. Children continued to play in small, hidden spaces, and artists documented the stark reality of their world. Each act was a defiance of invisibility, a testament that life persisted even when the body was worn thin. These gestures were tiny sparks of resistance, fragile but persistent, illuminating the darkness of a city designed to erase humanity. As the seasons turned, the ghetto faced new challenges. Cold winter winds cut through the streets, carrying the smell of smoke from the workshops, the tang of coal from the furnaces, and the lingering stench of illness. Hunger deepened, illness spread, and the labor required to maintain productivity grew heavier. Rumkowski's authority was tested daily. He had to balance German demands, the survival of workers, and the faint glimmer of hope that the ghetto could endure. Each decision weighed heavily, carrying moral and practical consequences. The illusion of stability was maintained through ritual and routine. Work schedules dictated the day. The factory whistle called the start of shifts, and the evening bells marked their end. Rations were distributed at precisely scheduled intervals. Even cultural events, though small and controlled, adhered to strict times. The ghetto's survival depended on this regimented order. Any deviation could invite chaos or attention from the Germans, and chaos in Lodz had lethal consequences. Rumkowski continued to walk the streets, inspecting workshops, visiting departments, meeting with foremen and supervisors. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of control. He encouraged efficiency, demanded loyalty, and tried to reinforce the illusion that survival was possible through discipline and labor. Yet everyone knew that his influence was limited. The Germans, distant but omnipresent, controlled the ultimate fate of the ghetto. Orders from Berlin carried absolute authority. Compliance bought time, but could not buy life. By late 1943, the ghetto had become a city of ghosts operating under the mechanics of survival. The remaining inhabitants had lost nearly all connection to the world beyond the fences. Rumors of the outside reached them in fragments: the advance of the Red Army, the defeats of German forces, the uprisings and liquidations in other ghettos. These stories offered fleeting hope, but they also served as a reminder that Lodz was isolated, vulnerable, and ultimately expendable. Every day, labor became both shield and burden. Workers maintained output, keeping the ghetto useful to the Germans. Yet each day's survival was a reminder of those who had already perished. Food was scarce, illness widespread, bodies frail. Yet the rhythm of the workshops persisted. The sound of machinery became a lullaby, a prayer, and a chain all at once. It reminded everyone that life, though diminished, continued, precarious, mechanical, and haunted by absence. Rumkowski's calculations and the Germans' demands created a fragile ecosystem of survival. Labor, hunger, disease, obedience, and fear existed in delicate equilibrium. Break one element, and the whole system could collapse. And in truth, it was already cracking. Morale was low, spirits were brittle, and every day brought the reminder that the machinery of life in Lodz was temporary. The people persisted because the alternative, stillness, inaction, meant death. Their endurance was both defiance and despair, proof of human resilience and vulnerability. By 1944, the Lodz ghetto remained, still productive, still under Rumkowski's administration, still under Bibo's oversight. But the illusion that labor alone could secure survival was eroding. The machinery of the ghetto, though still operational, had become a cruel paradox. Each act of work prolonged life, yet every hour spent producing goods for the Reich was an hour spent feeding the very system that sought to destroy them. The people of Lodz existed in a fragile balance, caught between survival and annihilation, labor and death, obedience and despair. The mechanics of survival had persisted longer in Lodz than in almost any other ghetto, but that persistence was a fragile veneer. Beneath it, hunger gnawed, disease spread, and fear festered. The workshops hummed, the machines clattered, and Rumkowski continued to manage the delicate equilibrium of life, labor, and illusion. The ghetto had endured, but its endurance was measured not in hope, not in freedom, but in the quiet, mechanical defiance of a population trapped behind fences, under the watchful eyes of their oppressors. And as the months passed, everyone knew, though no one dared speak it aloud, that the machinery of survival could not last forever. The Germans' appetite for extermination had not diminished. The deportations, the killings, the trains to the east, they were only delayed, not abandoned. The illusion of stability had bought time, but that time was running out, and the city within the fences was preparing, unknowingly, for the next stage of the Nazis' calculated plan. Chapter 13. The Final Months. Collapse and Deportation. 1944. The year 1944 began like any other in the Lodz Ghetto, with factories humming, machines clattering, and the thin, bitter scent of coal and smoke hanging over the streets. On the surface, the ghetto maintained the appearance of order, but beneath that rhythm, a storm was gathering. The war outside was changing rapidly. The Red Army advanced from the east, pushing German forces back through Poland, and with each victory, the inevitability of the ghetto's end became more apparent. Survival, which had once been tied to labor, obedience, and the illusion of indispensability, was becoming a fragile fiction. Rumkowski, once a commanding presence, now walked the ghetto like a ghost of his former self. The speeches that had rallied workers in earlier years now fell flat, their words hollow against the backdrop of despair. He still presided over administration, still issued orders, still tried to negotiate with Hans Bibo and German officials. But he knew the truth. The illusion he had relied upon, that productivity could buy safety, was gone. The Nazis no longer required proof of usefulness. Their aim had shifted. The ghetto was now a reservoir of bodies, and survival depended not on skill, obedience, or cunning, but on luck. By spring, the ghetto was almost unrecognizable. The population had shrunk drastically through years of starvation, disease, and deportations. Factories were still operating, but the workers were skeletal shadows of the people they had once been. Hunger gnawed at them relentlessly. Their movements were slow, deliberate, mechanical. Each stitch, each hammer strike, each turn of the loom was both an act of survival and a reminder of everything they had lost. Children were few, their absence a constant ache in the streets, in the workshops, in the hearts of every adult who had survived the September deportation. The ghetto had become a city of the living dead. Hans Bibo's reports to Berlin grew more urgent. The war was turning against Germany, supplies were dwindling, and the Reich demanded maximum output from minimum resources. Bibo pressured Rumkowski to increase quotas, speed production, and maintain order at all costs. Rumkowski complied, but each day his authority eroded further. The people no longer looked to him for guidance. They looked to the rhythm of survival itself. Work was the only law that mattered, and every mistake or delay could be fatal. In early summer, deportations resumed with ruthless precision. The remaining Jews, those who had survived starvation, disease, and previous waves of deportation, were now considered expendable. Lists were drawn up meticulously. Rumkowski was forced, once again, to provide names, to calculate who would be sent, who would remain. The moral calculus was excruciating. Children, the sick, the elderly, the very people labor could not save, were prioritized for removal. Rumkowski's decisions were a desperate attempt to protect some portion of the population, but each name he wrote was a life condemned. The ghetto streets filled with fear. Families hid their loved ones wherever they could, in attics, under floorboards, behind false walls. Mothers whispered prayers. Fathers clutched children to their chests, and siblings clung to each other with desperate determination. German soldiers moved through the streets like shadows, supported by the Jewish police, enforcing obedience with rifles and strict commands. Resistance was impossible. Escape was deadly. Compliance was the only path, however tenuous, between life and death. The transports were executed with chilling efficiency. Trucks carried people to Raid gas station, where they were loaded into trains bound for Auschwitz. Inside the cars, passengers were packed tightly, shoulder to shoulder, with barely room to breathe. The children clutched blankets or scraps of clothing. The elderly leaned on younger neighbors for support, and the sick were propped up as best as possible. The journey was suffocating, relentless, and for many, the last. When the trains reached Auschwitz, the process of extermination continued with horrifying precision. Those deemed unfit for labor were killed immediately. The healthy were selected, some to work in forced labor camps, others to be used as fodder for the Reich's industrial war machine. Back in the ghetto, silence fell over the streets in the aftermath of each transport. Empty apartments and deserted workshops became grim reminders of the people who had been taken. The living moved through the city like shadows, performing the rituals of survival without hope. Labor became not a path to safety, but a means to endure another day, a way to stave off despair through motion and repetition. Every hour spent at the workbench was both a defiance and a surrender, a way to exist in a world that sought to erase them. Rumkowski's administration attempted to maintain order, but the structure was cracking. Supervisors and foremen, exhausted and demoralized, struggled to enforce discipline. Workers moved slower, weaker from months of insufficient food, relentless labor, and fear. Illness spread through the ghetto, carried by lice, damp, and exhaustion. Hospitals overflowed, operating with minimal supplies. Doctors did what they could with the most rudimentary tools, boiling water and rags to treat wounds and infections. Mortality rates soared, further thinning the population, yet the machinery of survival persisted. The Jewish police, once instruments of authority and, in some eyes, collaborators, now moved through the streets burdened with the moral weight of their roles. They enforced compliance, rounded up the sick, collected bodies, and assisted with the deportations. Some officers wept in private, haunted by their actions. Others hardened themselves, seeing emotion as a liability. Every act of enforcement, every order carried out, was a reminder of the impossible choices imposed by survival within the ghetto. Even amid this despair, acts of resilience persisted. Teachers continued clandestine classes for the children who remained. Artists sketched and painted. Musicians played quietly in workshops or private rooms. These acts of creativity and education were small rebellions, moments of humanity asserting itself against the machinery of oppression. They were fragile sparks, but in the darkness of the ghetto, they mattered immensely. Each act of expression reminded the inhabitants that they were more than laborers, more than numbers on a list. Rumkowski himself became increasingly isolated. His speeches, once commanding, were now whispered to smaller groups, and his authority was met with muted compliance rather than devotion. The people no longer trusted that labor could save them. They understood, in their bones, that survival was precarious, that obedience could postpone death, but never prevent it. Rumkowski's calculations, designed to maintain control and protect as many as possible, were now measured against the reality of the Germans' shifting priorities. The illusion of influence had diminished. The summer of 1944 brought new terror. The Red Army advanced relentlessly, and German officers grew desperate to complete their plans before the Eastern Front collapsed further. Rumors of liquidation reached the ghetto, whispered by workers, couriers, and those returning from temporary labor assignments. Everyone understood what this meant. The ghetto's usefulness was reaching its limit. Labor could no longer guarantee survival. Efficiency could no longer defer the inevitable. In response, Rumkowski intensified his administrative efforts. He ordered new work schedules, increased quotas, and demanded that workshops operate at maximum efficiency. The remaining population, already skeletal and exhausted, complied. They worked not out of hope or belief, but out of the simple need to exist another day. Hunger, illness, and exhaustion had stripped them of energy for anything else. Each hour at the workbench became both a plea and a protest, a way to assert life in a world designed for annihilation. The deportations in the final months were methodical and relentless. The trains carried the sick, the elderly, and those deemed unproductive directly to Auschwitz. Others were sent to forced labor camps, where survival depended on strength, skill, and luck. The ghetto streets were filled with the sounds of crying, shouting, and marching boots. Families were torn apart, parents separated from children, siblings from each other. The emptiness left behind was palpable, a void that stretched through every alley, every courtyard, every abandoned workshop. Despite this, some semblance of order persisted. Factories continued to operate, workshops continued to produce goods for the Reich, and Rumkowski's administration continued to manage rations, labor assignments, and records. The illusion of stability remained, but it was fragile, held together by fear and exhaustion rather than authority or hope. The people of Lodz had become masters of endurance, moving through their daily routines with mechanical precision, aware that any deviation could be fatal. By late summer 1944, the ghetto had reached the final stage of its existence. The population had dwindled further, morale was at its lowest, and the machinery of survival was strained to its breaking point. Rumkowski, facing the inevitable, attempted one last gambit: appeals to the German administration, pledging total productivity, promising order, and offering every resource at his disposal. He hoped that demonstrating the ghetto's utility could delay its destruction, that compliance could preserve some fragment of life. But the Reich's plans had shifted irreversibly. The deportations accelerated. Trains departed daily, carrying thousands to death or forced labor. The streets of the ghetto emptied further. The workshops operated with fewer hands, and every day became a mirror of the one before. Labor, hunger, disease, deportation. The people moved through it with a strange, muted determination. Survival had become instinctual, a daily negotiation with an indifferent, omnipresent enemy. Each moment of life was precious, but constantly under threat. Rumkowski's influence waned entirely. Even those who had once defended his decisions began to question them. Was he a protector, a collaborator, or both? The distinction no longer mattered to the people who remained. They were too consumed with existing, too consumed with performing the daily rituals of survival to ponder morality. Labor, obedience, and endurance were the only currencies left. By autumn 1944, the ghetto was a shadow of itself. The factories still operated, but they were skeletal operations, manned by those who had survived the cumulative horrors of years under the fence. The remaining inhabitants were frail, haunted by memories of lost children, missing family members, and friends who had been deported or succumbed to disease. The ghetto streets were quiet, the silence heavy with absence. Survival persisted, but the spirit of the city had been broken. Even as the machinery of labor continued, everyone inside understood that the end was inevitable. The deportations, the exhaustion, the disease, and the advancing Red Army all pointed to one conclusion: the ghetto would not last. Rumkowski's calculations, the factory's output, the obedience of the inhabitants, none of it could alter the course of fate. The illusion of control that had sustained them for so long was finally dissolving. And yet, life continued. People woke each day, performed their tasks, and endured. Every stitch sewn, every nail hammered, every crate packed was a testament to human resilience in the face of overwhelming horror. Labor had become both shield and witness, the act of surviving while bearing witness to the destruction around them. The workshops were not merely factories. They were sanctuaries of memory, endurance, and quiet defiance against a world determined to erase them. In the final months, the Lodz Ghetto existed in a state of suspended reality. Death was omnipresent but delayed. Labor was the only guarantor of survival. Hunger, disease, and fear defined every moment, yet the people persisted. They worked, not because it promised life, but because it allowed them to maintain a fragile connection to it. Each day's survival was an act of quiet rebellion, a refusal to vanish quietly in a world intent on their erasure. The ghetto's machinery of labor, administration, and fear had kept it functioning longer than almost any other in occupied Poland. Yet all that remained was a fragile veneer. Every day was a negotiation with mortality, every hour a balance between existence and annihilation. Rumkowski and his administration, Bibo and the German officials, had delayed the inevitable, but they could not prevent it. Survival had become an industrial process, measured in stitches, hours, and rations, and the human cost of that survival had reached its apex. By late 1944, the Lodz Ghetto stood as a testament to both endurance and tragedy. The fences remained, the factories hummed, and the streets echoed with the rhythm of labor. Yet every face, every movement, every shadow was a reminder that survival was no longer a guarantee, that obedience and productivity could only postpone, not prevent, the devastation waiting beyond the walls. The city, once vibrant and chaotic, had become a mechanical monument to suffering, a testament to the cost of survival in a world designed to destroy it. Chapter 14. The Final Liquidation. Lodz Ghetto's Last Days, 1944 to 1945. By the autumn of 1944, the Lodz Ghetto had become a shadow of the city it once was. The fences remained, enclosing what little life had survived years of starvation, disease, and systematic deportations. The workshops hummed mechanically, the sewing machines and hammers marking the passage of time like metronomes in a world that had long since lost its rhythm. The streets, once alive with the bustle of commerce and children's laughter, were empty corridors of memory and grief. Survival had become a mechanical ritual, a fragile defiance against the encroaching inevitability that the ghetto would not endure. Rumkowski, the elder of the Jews, had aged dramatically in those years. His once authoritative presence now carried the weight of despair and exhaustion. The speeches that once inspired compliance and obedience now fell flat against the hardened faces of those who had endured too much. He moved through the workshops and streets, attempting to maintain order, to reinforce the illusion that life in the ghetto could continue. But he knew, as did everyone else, that the illusion had a finite lifespan. The Reich had decreed that the final liquidation was imminent, and no amount of labor or compliance could prevent it. Hans Bibo, the German administrator, continued to oversee operations with meticulous calculation. To him, the ghetto had always been a business, and even in its death, he sought efficiency. Trains were arranged, schedules finalized, and the remaining population categorized and sorted according to age, health, and perceived usefulness. Every human being was reduced to a line on a list, a number to be transported, a statistic to be logged. The final liquidation would be executed with the same bureaucratic precision that had governed every aspect of life in Lodz, turning destruction into administration, death into procedure. Rumkowski attempted one last effort to preserve life. He urged cooperation, promising that those who worked would survive. He created lists, negotiated with German officials, and tried to delay deportations, believing that demonstrating the ghetto's utility could save a portion of the population. Yet every action he took further implicated him in the machinery of destruction. The moral weight of these decisions bore down on him as heavily as the barbed wire weighed on the streets outside. Each signature he made was both a desperate act of survival and a surrender to the calculus of death imposed by the occupiers. The final days of the ghetto were marked by terror and despair. German soldiers, accompanied by the Jewish police, moved systematically through the streets, forcing inhabitants from their homes, separating families, and escorting the sick, elderly, and unproductive to waiting trucks and trains. Mothers clutched their children, fathers tried to shield the vulnerable, and siblings held on to each other with trembling desperation. The air was thick with fear, grief, and the faint smell of smoke from the factories, a scent that had once represented life, but now seemed intertwined with death. The trains carried the remaining inhabitants to Auschwitz and other extermination sites. Inside the cattle cars, the passengers were packed tightly, their bodies pressed against each other with no room to move. The cries of children and the groans of the sick filled the confined spaces, blending with the rattle of wheels and the low, ominous hum of the locomotives. For many, this was the final journey. Those who survived the journey were met with selections, labor assignments, or immediate execution, the efficiency of the system ensuring that the machinery of death operated without hesitation. Back in the ghetto, empty streets and abandoned homes became silent monuments to the lives that had been lost. Workshops were stripped of workers, their tools idle, the hum of machinery replaced by an oppressive quiet. The few who remained moved like shadows, performing the rituals of survival with mechanical precision, aware that their time was limited. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion had already claimed much of the population, and the final liquidation would complete what years of deprivation had begun. Rumkowski's authority, once absolute, had eroded completely. The people no longer looked to him for guidance or protection. His presence was a reminder of the impossible choices he had made, the decisions that had dictated who lived and who died. Some viewed him with resentment, others with pity. His attempts to negotiate with the Germans, to preserve life through compliance, had failed. The ghetto had become a place where survival was no longer possible in any meaningful sense, and obedience could no longer shield anyone from annihilation. Even amid the terror, acts of human resilience persisted. Teachers continued clandestine lessons for those who remained. Musicians played quietly during brief breaks in labor, and artists documented the stark reality of the ghetto on scraps of paper and fabric. These acts were fragile sparks of defiance, reminders that humanity persisted even in the face of total dehumanization. Each sketch, each note, each whispered lesson was an assertion of identity and memory in a city designed to erase both. The Jewish police, who had enforced order for years, faced impossible choices during the final liquidation. Some refused to participate and were punished or executed. Others carried out orders with grim determination, attempting to shield themselves from the consequences of failure. Every act of enforcement, every name checked off a list, every person escorted to the trains was a reminder of the moral compromises imposed by the machinery of survival. The boundaries between coercion, complicity, and resistance blurred, leaving only the stark reality of existence under occupation. As autumn deepened, the ghetto's population dwindled further. The remaining inhabitants were mostly able-bodied adults, whose labor had been deemed essential by the Germans. Even their survival was precarious, dependent on meeting quotas, adhering to strict schedules, and maintaining the appearance of compliance. The workshops continued to operate, but the rhythm of life had become mechanical and hollow. Each task was performed not with hope or pride, but with the grim understanding that survival was temporary, and the ghetto itself was nearing its final chapter. Rumkowski attempted to maintain morale through routine. He issued decrees, oversaw ration distribution, and encouraged productivity. But his words were increasingly hollow. The people, skeletal and exhausted, obeyed out of necessity rather than belief. Labor had ceased to be a path to salvation and had become a ritual of endurance, a way to exist in a world that sought to erase them. Each day was measured not by hope or achievement, but by the simple act of waking, moving, and surviving one more hour. By late 1944, the German administration began preparations for the ghetto's complete liquidation. Plans were drawn, lists finalized, and logistics arranged. Trains would transport the remaining population to Auschwitz and other sites, where the majority would be executed. The factories would be stripped of workers and resources, the streets emptied, the city erased. The meticulous planning reflected the Nazis' obsession with efficiency. Human life was reduced to inventory, and death became a process to be managed with precision. As the final deportations began, the streets of the ghetto were filled with fear and desperation. Families clung to each other, children cried, the elderly stumbled under the weight of exhaustion. The Jewish police enforced compliance with grim determination, knowing that resistance would be met with immediate execution. Mothers tried to hide children, fathers attempted to protect relatives, siblings held hands as they were dragged to waiting trucks. The air was thick with grief, terror, and the faint smell of smoke from the workshops that continued to operate amidst the chaos. The trains departed for Auschwitz, their cargo human lives packed tightly, shoulder to shoulder, with barely space to breathe. Inside, the cries of children, the groans of the sick, and the whispered prayers of the elderly blended with the mechanical rattle of wheels. Many did not survive the journey. Those who did faced selections upon arrival, with some sent to forced labor and others executed immediately. The efficiency of the process ensured that no one escaped the machinery of death. Back in the ghetto, empty streets and abandoned homes bore witness to the lives that had been taken. Factories fell silent, workshops abandoned, and the rhythm of labor ceased. The few who remained moved mechanically through the streets, performing necessary tasks with hollow precision. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion continued to claim lives, and the final liquidation completed the devastation that years of deprivation and deportations had wrought. Rumkowski's influence, once a protective force, had vanished. He had attempted to negotiate, to delay, to preserve life through obedience, but the Germans had no interest in survival. His administration had failed to shield the population, and his legacy became one of impossible moral compromise. The ghetto had become a city of shadows, its inhabitants ghosts maintaining routines in the absence of hope, their lives measured in hours and tasks rather than freedom or security. Despite the devastation, human resilience persisted. Teachers continued clandestine lessons. Musicians played quietly. Artists recorded memories on scraps of paper and fabric. These acts of defiance, though small, preserved identity and memory, ensuring that even as the ghetto's physical presence was erased, its story endured. Each sketch, note, and whispered lesson became a testament to endurance and a record of the human spirit under total oppression. By the end of 1944, the Lodz Ghetto had been transformed completely. The population was almost entirely deported, the workshops silent, and the streets empty. The city that had survived through years of labor, obedience, and illusion had finally been consumed by the machinery of extermination. Survival had proven temporary, obedience futile, and labor insufficient to forestall death. The ghetto's existence had been a grim testament to endurance, but its final liquidation underscored the inevitability of the Nazis' systematic destruction. The final days of the ghetto revealed the cruelest paradox of all. Labor, which had sustained life for years, could not prevent annihilation. The workshops, the factories, the administrative structures, all that had once symbolized survival, were emptied, stripped, and abandoned. The fences remained, enclosing nothing but silence and memory. The people who had persisted, who had endured, were transported to the sites of their deaths, their absence leaving an unfillable void in the streets and buildings they had once inhabited. The Lodz Ghetto, once the second largest in occupied Poland, had existed for nearly 6 years under the machinery of oppression. Its survival had been remarkable, a testament to human endurance and the illusion of utility. Yet in the final liquidation, The city's existence was erased, its population scattered to forced labor or extermination, its workshops silenced, and its streets emptied. The fences remained, standing as mute witnesses to the lives that had been lived, lost, and systematically destroyed. Rumkowski himself did not survive the final days. Captured during the liquidation, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he was executed along with many of the ghetto's remaining inhabitants. Hans Bibo fled, but was later captured, tried, and executed for his role in administering the ghetto. Their deaths were a final testament to the machinery of destruction they had both perpetuated and managed. Men whose legacies were forever entwined with the suffering of the thousands who had lived and died under their authority. The Lodz Ghetto ceased to exist physically, but its memory endured. Survivors carried with them stories of endurance, terror, and resilience. The workshops, the fences, the streets, and the factories were gone, but the narrative of the ghetto, its machinery of labor, its moral compromises, its survival and ultimate liquidation, became a testament to the human capacity to endure unimaginable suffering. Even in its destruction, the ghetto remained a powerful symbol of the Holocaust, a reminder of the cost of survival under totalitarian tyranny and the fragility of life under industrialized death. And so, by the winter of 1944, the Lodz Ghetto, once a bustling center of Jewish life and forced labor, stood empty. Its people had been deported, its workshops silenced, its streets abandoned. Survival had been delayed, but not prevented. Labor had extended life, but only to prolong suffering. And obedience, the illusion that had sustained so many, had ultimately proven powerless against the calculated machinery of Nazi extermination. The city within fences was gone, leaving behind only memory, silence, and a haunting testament of human endurance in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Chapter 15, Aftermath and Memory, the End of the Lodz Ghetto. The gates of the Lodz Ghetto, once the boundaries of life and death, now stood empty. Silence had replaced the hum of workshops, the clatter of machines, the cries of children, the shouts of foremen, the steps of countless workers whose labor had sustained an illusion of life for years. Where streets had once carried the rhythm of survival, they now carried only memory. The ghetto had ceased to exist, its fences no longer enclosing bodies, but enclosing history, a history written in absence, loss, and the faint, persistent echo of human endurance under the machinery of oppression. By the winter of 1945, only a handful of survivors remained in hiding. Those who had escaped the trains, concealed themselves during deportations, or survived the forced labor that had claimed so many. Their bodies were thin, weakened by years of insufficient food, disease, and exhaustion. Their eyes were hollow, their hands blistered and calloused, and their minds burdened with the trauma of loss. They emerged from basements, attics, and hidden rooms into streets that no longer belonged to them, where homes were empty, workshops were stripped, and factories silent. Each step was both relief and terror, relief to survive, terror for what remained outside these empty streets. Rumkowski was gone, a shadow, erased along with the population he had sought to control. He had been deported to Auschwitz, executed alongside thousands who had relied upon his fragile administration for survival. Hans Bibo, the architect of the ghetto's mechanized cruelty, had fled, only to be captured later and held accountable for his role in overseeing and profiting from human suffering. Their absence left a vacuum in the narrative, but also crystallized the truth. The ghetto had been maintained not by mercy, but by bureaucratic efficiency, coercion, and the relentless calculus of survival versus annihilation. The city that had been Lodz before the war now faced the task of reclaiming its space and memory. Buildings bore the scars of overcrowding, neglect, and violence. Streets were littered with remnants of human life. Discarded shoes, scraps of clothing, broken furniture, scattered papers, and the faint traces of meals eaten long ago. Each artifact told a story of existence under siege, of labor imposed by tyranny, and of lives measured not in days or years, but in rations, quotas, and bureaucratic decrees. The physical landscape bore witness to human suffering, and yet it could not fully convey the magnitude of loss. For the survivors, returning to normal life was impossible. The trauma of years under Nazi occupation, the loss of families, children, and neighbors, and the memories of those deported to Chelmno, Auschwitz, and other extermination sites weighed heavily. Every corner of the ghetto streets, every remaining building, every factory or workshop served as a reminder of what had been endured and what had been destroyed. Yet despite this, the human instinct to rebuild, to remember, and to bear witness persisted. Survivors documented what they could, recounting daily routines, labor schedules, deportation lists, and the faces of those lost. Historians, investigators, and humanitarian organizations later pored over these records, trying to reconstruct the reality of the ghetto. They examined production lists, ration distributions, and administrative reports, tracing the machinery of survival and oppression that had sustained the ghetto for almost 6 years. Each document was a testament to the calculated cruelty of the Nazis and the impossible choices faced by those who administered and survived the ghetto. They showed not only the systematic extermination of a people, but also the resilience, ingenuity, and endurance required to maintain life under impossible conditions. The workshops, once buzzing with activity, now stood silent. The sewing machines, hammers, looms, and anvils, which had been instruments of survival, were now relics of a destroyed world. In the stillness, the ghosts of labor remained, a testament to human endurance even in the face of systemic dehumanization. Survivors spoke of the repetitive rhythm of the workday, the clattering of machinery, the exhaustion that blurred the boundaries between life and death. That rhythm had been both a lifeline and a prison, offering structure while masking the fragility of existence. Cultural artifacts from the ghetto emerged as testaments to both survival and memory. Teachers and artists, musicians and writers, had left traces of life behind, sketches of courtyards, songs about labor and endurance, writings about daily existence and hope deferred. These acts, however small, preserved human identity amidst the machinery of oppression. They reminded the world that even in the darkest conditions, individuals had sought to assert their humanity, to record experience, and to maintain continuity with life beyond the fences. The Holocaust, in the context of Lodz, was both immediate and systematic. The deportations, the starvation, the labor, and the bureaucracy had been interwoven into a single process of annihilation. Survival had required compliance, endurance, and often complicity, but even these measures were insufficient against the scale and intent of the Nazi machinery. The ghetto's existence had been remarkable, not as a haven, but as a calculated demonstration of controlled suffering, a model of organized terror under the guise of utility. Internationally, Lodz became a symbol of both endurance and tragedy. Scholars and survivors chronicled the unique circumstances that allowed the ghetto to persist longer than many others, analyzing the interplay between labor, administration, and exploitation. They documented the moral complexities faced by Jewish leaders like Rumkowski, who attempted to navigate survival under the shadow of totalitarian control. His decisions, debated for decades, illustrated the ethical ambiguities imposed by systematic oppression and the impossible trade-offs between life, death, and utility. In the immediate post-war period, reconstruction efforts in Lodz confronted not only the physical devastation, but also the psychological and moral consequences of the ghetto's existence. Returning residents faced the empty streets, the ruined infrastructure, and the memories of neighbors and families who had been eradicated. Monuments and memorials were erected, but no structure could fully capture the daily realities of hunger, labor, disease, and terror that defined life within the fences. Survivors spoke, wrote, and testified to ensure that these stories remained part of the historical record. Memory became the final sanctuary of the ghetto. Oral histories, diaries, and testimonies captured the experience of those who had survived, recording the rhythms of labor, the terror of deportations, the omnipresence of hunger, and the faint glimmers of human resilience. Each account provided insight into how people endured, adapted, and, in some instances, resisted. They revealed the psychological toll of living in a city stripped of freedom, where every action was measured against survival and compliance. The machinery of survival in the Lodz Ghetto, while ultimately unable to prevent annihilation, demonstrated the extent to which human beings could endure under extreme duress. The workshops, administration, and labor systems that had once dictated daily life were later analyzed as models of enforced order, highlighting the ways in which oppression and endurance were intertwined. Human ingenuity, cultural preservation, and the will to live were continually exercised against an apparatus designed to erase both. In the years following liberation, survivors returned to Lodz to reclaim whatever remnants they could. They found streets lined with rubble, abandoned homes, and the skeletal remains of workshops. The memories of the ghetto were everywhere, in the empty benches, in the silent classrooms, in the cobblestones scarred by years of labor and loss. Yet despite the devastation, survivors engaged in acts of reconstruction, attempting to restore life to a city that had endured 6 years of systematic oppression. The stories of the Lodz Ghetto have become integral to the broader understanding of the Holocaust. They illustrate the complexity of survival under totalitarian systems, the moral dilemmas faced by those attempting to navigate life under tyranny, and the indomitable human will to endure against overwhelming odds. The ghetto's history is preserved not only in records and memorials, but in the lived experiences of those who survived and bore witness. The aftermath of the ghetto's liquidation also reveals the deep scars left on human psychology. Survivors carried the weight of memories, of children lost, of families torn apart, of labor performed under the shadow of death. Trauma permeated every aspect of post-war life, influencing personal relationships, cultural expressions, and collective memory. These experiences, passed through generations, became part of the enduring narrative of human resilience and suffering. As historians, scholars, and the public continue to study the Lodz Ghetto, its lessons remain vital. The ghetto exemplifies the lethal combination of bureaucracy, forced labor, and systematic oppression. It demonstrates how survival can be manipulated and measured, how obedience and utility can temporarily delay destruction, and how human endurance can persist even under the most extreme conditions. It also serves as a sobering reminder of the consequences of dehumanization, the fragility of morality under duress, and the capacity for cruelty when efficiency becomes a measure of worth. The final days of the Lodz Ghetto mark the end of a dark chapter in history, but they also affirm the persistence of memory as a form of survival. Though the fences are gone, the workshops silent, and the streets empty, the legacy of the ghetto endures through testimony, scholarship, and the lives of survivors. Its story is one of suffering, endurance, and moral complexity, a testament to human resilience and a cautionary tale of the consequences of industrialized cruelty. In reflecting on the Lodz Ghetto, the world confronts not only the horrors of systematic extermination, but also the fragile nature of survival and the human capacity to endure against unimaginable odds. The ghetto's history reminds us that endurance is never merely physical. It is emotional, psychological, and moral. The people who lived and labored within its fences carried the weight of survival, witnessing atrocities while maintaining the structures that allowed life to persist, however tenuously. By the end of 1945, the city had been liberated, but the legacy of the ghetto remained etched in every corner of Lodz. Survivors rebuilt their lives, families, and communities, carrying forward the memory of those who perished. Memorials were erected, testimonies recorded, and the history of the ghetto preserved for future generations. The lessons of Lodz, of labor, endurance, compliance, and resistance, became an enduring part of the collective memory of the Holocaust. The Lodz Ghetto, once a functioning city of forced labor and survival, had been transformed into a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human spirit. Its story is preserved not only in archives and memorials, but in the enduring narratives of those who lived through it, who bore witness, and who refused to let the memories of the lost be erased. Even in death, the ghetto speaks, reminding the world of the consequences of systematic oppression and the profound strength required to endure under such conditions. The final chapter of the Lodz Ghetto is not only a story of destruction, but also a story of remembrance, a reminder that the machinery of cruelty can never completely erase memory, identity, or the testament of those who survived. Through endurance, testimony, and reflection, the lessons of Lodz persist, a stark, haunting, and vital chapter in human history, ensuring that the suffering endured within its fences continues to be acknowledged, understood, and remembered.